When you're a single mom, struggling to do it all, love often takes a back seat. Gail Couvreau can vouch for that.
I was in my 30s, and I'd already been through one marriage. I was working for a delivery company and had just purchased a daycare center that was quite large, and trying to juggle that and the house and the yard and the kids was really busy.
She was in and out of a few relationships, nothing very serious. She didn't really have too much time for dating.
But one summer day in 1996, while working her delivery job, a chance encounter would turn Gail's love life around.
I walked in one of my deliveries and I thought, wow, look at him. Dark hair, dark eyes, gorgeous.
32-year-old Scott Mawton was a divorced father of 2 young girls. By day, a humble graphic designer. By night, the sexy lead guitarist in a popular Seattle area band.
I wonder because, musicians, they're wild, they're crazy, they're on drugs, they're partying every night. But he was different.
In a music scene dominated by grunge and heroin, Scott was a rare straight arrow.
He didn't drink, he didn't do drugs. He was raising one of his daughters, smart, good-looking. He was just all around perfect.
Gail piqued Scott's interest, too. A few months later, Scott asked her out, and Gail was thrilled.
It was probably the best date that I had ever had with a man. We spent the entire evening just talking about our children and lots of laughter.
When my mom first met Scott, I was around the age of 11. I could tell that she had kind of fallen head over heels for him.
We started seeing each other pretty quickly. It really turned into a very solid relationship.
At last, Gail thought she had finally found her perfect match. But a few months later, she observed something odd when she and Scott were on vacation in Hawaii.
We were driving along and we were going to go to dinner. And suddenly, I looked over at Scott and he's like slumping over the steering wheel and just making weird faces. And I said, "Are you okay?" And he goes, "No, I'm not. I need to get some food or something. I'm hyperglycemic."
Gail quickly drove to the nearest restaurant where Scott stumbled into the restroom.
He looked really bad. So I asked, "Please, can you just bring us some bread immediately?"
But oddly, by the time Scott came out of the restroom a few minutes later, he was completely recovered.
He comes out, informs me, everything's fine. I thought, well, how in the world could that be? But I let it go. I didn't know what to think.
Gail and Scott carried on with their day. And later that night, Scott had a surprise in store for Gail. He popped the question.
I was so excited. I didn't even have to think about it twice.
Almost a year after they started dating, Gail and Scott made it official in a small church wedding back home near Bothell, Washington.
My mom was a little nervous at the beginning, just like any bride would be. It was a good thing to see her coming down the aisle.
The day of my wedding was one of the happiest days of my life. It was a beautiful day, all the friends and family there, and the kids just loved him so much. I thought this was for life.
It was a promising start for the Mawton family. Until Halloween night, just 2 months into their marriage.
I was invited to go to a dinner with my family, and Scott had a show that night. And I got home and went to bed expecting him to be home late because they have to break down their equipment.
But hours after the show ended, around 4 a.m., Scott still hadn't returned.
I was very worried. I didn't know what could have possibly happened to him. I hadn't had a phone call. So I called cell phone with no answer.
24 hours later, still with no word from Scott, Gail was frantic and fearing the worst.
She was calling all of their friends and checking hospitals. She called State Patrol, everybody she could think of to try to find him.
Was Scott in trouble? Was it hypoglycemia? Or was something far more sinister going on?
I was panicked. It was just like he vanished.
On October 31st, 1997, just 2 months into their marriage, Gail Couvreau's husband Scott went to his concert and never came home. Suddenly, after more than 24 hours without word, Scott called.
He said he was okay. He was acting like he was remorseful, but he really didn't have a good answer.
Sheepishly, Scott explained that he'd gone out with friends after the gig and had stayed out so late that he was afraid to come home.
He decided he would just spend the night with these people. It didn't make any sense to me. So I was angry.
But in an effort to keep the peace, Gail told Scott to hurry home.
I had just been married 2 months, and I really, really wanted it to work. So I forgave him. You made a mistake. You know how it made me feel. Please don't do it to me again.
Gail put the incident behind her, and life for the couple was soon back on track. By the spring of 1998, Gail sold her daycare business for a $300,000 profit, and the family moved into a gorgeous new home.
They'd have parties and invite all of us over. They were coming into their own.
Meanwhile, Gail continued to work part-time, while Scott quit his computer job to focus on his music.
Scott was doing great with his music career. There was one album that had come out. He was nominated one of the best guitar players in Seattle.
It was an exciting time for the family. But 1 year into their marriage, their good life began to crumble.
It was almost like a gray cloud kind of came over the family. Like something just wasn't right.
By the fall of 1998, the family began to think that Scott was acting strange.
We were arguing more. He was away from the house a lot more, just really starting to distance himself from us.
Seemed like he was sick a lot more often than anyone else in the family, like a mild cold at all times.
Even worse, Gail felt Scott was overlooking the kids.
Suddenly he said he didn't have enough time to take them to their sports or to go show up for their games. He was too busy with the music and the record coming out.
It seemed like he was trying to find reasons or excuses not to be there at night.
And as Scott's behavior continued to decline, according to Gail, so did their bank account.
Gail estimated that their checking account was depleting by about $200 a day. And when she asked Scott to explain himself, he either got angry or he had some explanation, a camera, a guitar repair. He always had a reason for what was going on.
By the winter of 1999, the relationship was in serious trouble, and Gail feared the worst.
I'm not thinking drinking. He's not hungover. Drugs. He doesn't do drugs. So maybe, could it be another woman?
But before she confronted Scott, Gail decided to do some investigating of her own.
When I could hear him down in the den, I heard some shaking, and I thought, that kind of sounds weird. I wonder what that is. It sounds like pills shaking. So I pretended like I was asleep, and I waited till he came up to bed, and then I just lied there for a while, and then I snuck downstairs.
Inside Scott's guitar case, Gail saw something that stopped her in her tracks.
I found a couple bottles of pills with his name on them. I didn't know what it was. Had never recognized the name of the drug.
The next morning, Gail called Scott and demanded an answer. His response blew her away.
I flat out asked him, "Are you a heroin addict?" And he admitted that yes, he was.
According to Gail, Scott told her he took the pills to fight withdrawal symptoms.
I just cried. I was very upset. Heroin is horrible. It's a horrible drug.
According to Gail, Scott agreed to check into rehab, but soon he was home.
I was actually sitting in the backyard reading a magazine. It was a beautiful sunny day. And I looked up and there was Scott. And I thought, well, what in the world? Why are you here? And he said, well, I got kicked out of the rehab. He said it had something to do with the insurance.
And Scott was adamant that further rehab would have to wait. He had just received a lucrative job offer, playing backup on a solo album for the lead singer of a popular heavy metal band.
He assured me that when it was all over, then he would get himself help.
But according to Gail, before long the couple's bank account was dwindling once again. And suddenly Scott stopped coming home. Gail had a hunch that Scott was digging himself deeper into addiction.
He wasn't around at all. He wouldn't even tell me where he was living. I just was falling apart. I didn't believe that he was off the drugs. Things were getting out of control. I didn't know what to do.
With the couple essentially separated, Gail had no choice but to take Scott's name off their bank account. But that didn't stop him.
He would just go into the bank and with one of my checks that he had stolen and just say, "Oh no, we're back together again. Everything's fine."
He was literally flushing our money down the drain. And so it was very distressing and a terrible time in our lives.
By the spring of 2001, Gail's funds were down to almost nothing. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get much worse, they did.
I just lied awake all night long wondering when these people were going to come after us.
Gail was petrified. She lived in constant fear.
In the spring of 2001, Gail Couvreau hadn't heard from her husband in over 2 months when she received a most disturbing call.
I got a call from one of Scott's friends, one of his new friends that he was hanging out with. He said, "There's things about Scott that I think you need to know."
The friend warned Gail to seek protection for herself and her children.
I was literally terrified. I was very frightened for myself and my children.
Gail was a nervous wreck. She was shaking, and I was really worried about her.
Gail was determined to protect her children at all costs, so she put their house up for rent and moved.
I didn't feel safe being there anymore, so the best thing I could think of was just, let's get away and see if we can hide from them.
Gail would take different routes home from work, and she was always afraid of where Scott was and what he was planning next.
After almost a year on the run, with no sign of Scott or his friends, Gail's fear slowly subsided.
I thought, okay, this is it. He's finally out of our lives, and we can go on.
So Gail and the children moved back into their home.
I had it leased out for these people. They decided that they didn't want to buy it. So I had to move back into the house to get it prepared to be sold.
I don't know how Gail held it together. It was amazing to me that she actually could get up and get to work and get her job done every day.
But Gail's ordeal wasn't over yet. Within a week, Scott showed up and drove off in one of her cars.
He's already taken everything from me, and then he takes my car. I couldn't believe it. I just couldn't believe that he had the gall to do this after everything else that he had done.
Gail was on the lookout for Scott, and then one day she spotted him.
So I'm driving down the road, and there comes my car, pulls right out in front of me. I'm like, oh my God, there it is. So I picked up the phone, I called the police, he pulls into the gas station. Next thing I knew, there's 6 cop cars, 12 guns pointed at Scott, the car. I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe this is really happening.
Scott was promptly arrested and taken into custody. By now, there were also warrants out on him from another county. By 2003, Gail filed for bankruptcy and divorce.
My life was just shattered, and I was trying to hold everything together.
Gail was done, and by the end of 2003, her divorce from Scott was final. But Scott's run-ins with the law were far from over. In the spring of 2004, Gail turned on the news and saw her ex-husband.
When I looked at the screen, he's in jail, in a little jail outfit.
Scott had been arrested once again for something else entirely.
Scott had a big operation going. I knew he wasn't going to stop.
I just couldn't believe that this was the man that I married.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. In April of 2004, Gail watched the news in total shock as her ex-husband Scott Mawton had been arrested again. But not for drugs.
I was shocked because I thought if anything that he was going to be arrested for, it would be drugs. He was running this huge identity theft ring. I had not a clue.
It appeared Scott had been using his computer know-how and an arsenal of high-tech equipment to manufacture fake IDs.
Scott's operation was pretty big. He would have people working for him to get some of the information, sometimes all of it, sometimes not. Whatever he didn't get, he was smart enough to be able to fill in on his own.
They would go to an apartment complex and break into the back of the mailbox panel and just take all the mail. And they did it over and over and over again.
It's my understanding from the police that when they were able to get into his apartment, there was really no living situation whatsoever. A computer, bags and bags and bags of mail.
Among the evidence, authorities found fake passports, driver's licenses, stolen credit cards, and even falsified FBI credentials.
You're stealing from innocent people who had nothing to do with anything and destroying their lives, as if destroying mine and my children's wasn't bad enough.
A few weeks later, Scott went to court, but his case was thrown out due to a problem with the search warrant.
I got the call the next day that there was a technicality and he was set free. I couldn't believe it.
Scott was now a free man. But by the summer of 2007, he would turn up again on the Linwood Police Department's most wanted list.
I received a call from one of our patrol officers. A person had come into our local Lexus dealership and purchased a $71,000 Lexus. The identification had his picture, but the information belonged to the victim of a burglary.
It didn't take police long to identify the photo on the fraudulent license.
I had several responses from nearby agencies that all said it was Scott Mawton. Everybody kind of knew who he was. He'd been committing crimes all over the place, and many agencies were looking for him. I placed Scott on our 10 most wanted list because I knew he wasn't going to stop.
I turned on the TV early in the morning, and there he was on the news, and I couldn't believe it. And I grabbed my phone and called Gail, and I said, "The rock star's at it again."
Scott had fooled everybody into believing he was this rich, famous, successful rock star. He needed the car to drive to fulfill that. He needed to be able to really use the car, though, to go and commit his crimes. He could drive up in a beautiful car. People figured he must have money. Made his life a little easier.
On August 31st, 2007, Scott was arrested and later charged with 10 counts of identity theft, forgery, and possession of stolen property. On February 5th, 2008, 12 years after Gail first met Scott Mawton, he was sentenced to 6 years in prison.
I was glad that Scott was going to jail for a long time once he got sentenced. It feels good knowing that he'll be sitting in prison.
Scott was given the most time that they were legally able to give him. I clapped. I cheered.
Today, Gail lives with her good friend Marka and is slowly picking up the pieces. But she still feels the sting of Scott's betrayal.
Scott took from me
But there's still life ahead, and I'm still alive and breathing, and so is my mom and my brother, and he can't take everything.
I think that when we go through these things, it changes us. I think it makes us a stronger person, even though we hate hearing that. But I think it makes you take a look at what's important and what isn't important.
Joy DeSombre wasn't the type of woman who needed a man in her life. The 28-year-old single mom and college student had been down that road before.
I wasn't really interested in dating. When I'd finally gotten out of my first marriage, I was just sort of relieved and happy and very independent, and I had my 2 toddlers. I was moving forward in my life.
Men weren't on Joy's radar until a friend persuaded her to try her hand at online dating.
I met several different men. I just kept being disappointed. Nothing was really special to me about any of these men.
That is, until January 2002, when Joy began chatting with Joseph Kua, who said he was a 48-year-old commercial real estate broker with a degree from a prominent university.
Joseph was so far above and beyond all the other guys, everything you could ever dream of. Romantic, spontaneous, fun, exciting, intellectual.
The only downside was that Joseph lived in Northern California, about 8 hours from Joy's San Diego home. But he was willing to travel for love. A month later, Joseph came to town and took Joy out on a proper date.
We went to dinner and we stayed there long after other people had already left. We were just having an amazing conversation.
Joseph just seemed to do everything right and say everything right. He asked her a lot of questions about herself, and they seemed immediately taken with each other.
Before long, the two began to date, and Joy noticed how great Joseph was with her children, quickly becoming the father figure they'd never had.
He would do anything they wanted. He was teaching them sports. He was just the all-American dad.
And Joseph seemed to have a disposable income, which he showered on Joy and her children. But exactly how Joseph made his money was a bit of a mystery.
I was never quite sure what Joseph did for a living. When you asked him about his job, he would simply say, "I'm in commercial real estate."
He said specifically, "I like to separate my business from my personal life. I make a lot of money, I'm very successful, but it is stressful what I do." And I thought, well, everything else about him is so wonderful. Why am I going to be so picky about this?
So Joy put her concerns aside, and by the fall of 2002, she and Joseph started talking marriage. They planned an intimate ceremony for the following June in Kauai, Hawaii.
He had grown up in Hawaii, and he told me all about it, so we were very excited about that.
Joseph's only wedding guests were going to be his longtime friend and business partner, 75-year-old Fernand Wagner, and his 64-year-old wife, Suzanne.
Joseph said that he had met Fernand, I think about a couple of decades before, and that Fernand had been a really successful restaurateur, and they had partnered up to be in commercial real estate together.
Joseph told Joy he was even the trustee on their will.
They didn't have any children, and Joseph was there for them. He helped them do a lot of things. He was their boy in a way.
But in February 2003, 4 months before the Wagners were to join Joy and Joseph on their wedding day, Joy received some surprising news.
I got pregnant. So by June, I was about 5 months along, and I couldn't fit into the wedding dress.
The wedding was postponed, but their lives together moved forward with the purchase of a beautiful 4-bedroom home in Southern California. Joy was excited until Joseph told her something odd.
He let me know that his name was going to be the only one on the title because he had a lot more money than I did. I argued with him about that, but he promised me that once we got married, that he'd add my name to the title to the house.
So Joy decided to let the argument go. She felt lucky to have a man like Joseph. But 3 years later, her luck would run out. On June 14th, 2006, around 7 p.m., Joseph called Joy from Northern California. He was on his way home and had devastating news.
Hello? Joseph received a phone call from Fernand's nephew that Fernand had been murdered. And I asked about Suzanne, and he said, "Oh, she's dead too." I was so shocked. I said, oh my God, I can't believe this could have happened. And he acted like it was no big deal.
Joy assumed that Joseph was in shock, but when he arrived home later that evening, he seemed eerily calm.
got on the computer, emailed some of the friends and family members of the Wagners. So sorry to hear that this has happened. And then he went to the gym.
The next morning, Joy slowly rolled over in bed and noticed something even more strange.
His hand was very badly swollen and purple, and you could see the blood right into the skin. Something seemed and felt desperately wrong.
In October 2003, 3 years before Joy DeSomber learned that her husband's business partners had been murdered, she and Joseph were celebrating the birth of a beautiful baby girl.
We agreed that we would name her Kauai, since that was the island where we were supposed to get married, so that was really special to us.
With a new baby, a destination wedding no longer seemed feasible. But 2 months later, Joseph had a surprise for Joy.
Joseph said, "Why don't we get married now? We'll go to Vegas." He said, "I'll just fly your parents out, and now we can make it official."
Joy was thrilled, and a week before Christmas, she and Joseph read their vows in a small chapel in Las Vegas.
He talked about how he had found his soulmate. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard.
Over the next year, the couple thrived as Joy took a job as an auto adjuster, and Joseph worked hard to provide for his new family.
He always seemed to have money for anything we wanted to do. We took nice vacations. We had a couple of boats. We definitely were living, I thought, the nice life.
But Joseph was still working 8 hours away in Northern California, and the distance between the newlyweds was beginning to wear on Joy.
Every time we planned a vacation, he would end up shortening it at the last minute because he'd have to race back up north for business. He never had a set schedule.
Joy began to worry that there might be other reasons why Joseph was away so much.
He would say I couldn't call him sometimes in the morning because he claimed he was out golfing with friends. I thought for sure that he was probably with someone else.
It didn't seem that he'd have any inclination to cheat because he seemed completely devoted to Joy and to the children.
Everybody reminded me, well, he does all these amazing things for you. I couldn't help but think, wow, maybe I am just being too nitpicky.
But in January 2005, just over a year into their marriage, Joy received a phone call that confirmed her deepest fear.
A woman from Northern California called me. She said that she had been seeing Joseph for the last 2 years.
She told Joy he had actually signed a domestic partnership with this woman, which in California is the same as a marriage.
According to the other woman, Joseph had described Joy as a crazy, strung-out addict with whom he'd had a one-night stand and a baby.
I responded that I was gainfully employed, that I didn't do drugs, that these things weren't true. I was just really blown away.
Joy immediately called Joseph and confronted him, but it was like talking to a stranger.
He said that it was my fault that he found her in the first place. He didn't have these small children running around like at our home. And it was more peaceful for him to go there. I couldn't believe that he let it go like that.
I felt so bad for her. My heart just ached. She was hysterical. She was sad. She was angry.
Joy wanted out of the marriage, but Joseph threatened that if she left, he would fight her for custody of Kauai and win. And there was something very unsettling about the tone of his voice.
I could almost feel it in my body, this horrible, hollowed-out darkness. It was almost like the feeling of evil.
In the winter of 2005, after discovering Joseph's infidelity, Joy DeSomber wanted out of her marriage, but knew she was trapped.
He would remind me that if I left, I would have nothing. He would say, "You'll be a bad mother, I can prove it in court, I can get full custody of Kauai, you'll probably lose your other 2 children. He was always threatening.
So Joy came up with a plan to prepare herself for an inevitable divorce and did what she could to squirrel money away to her mother.
I could probably only send her $50, $100, maybe $150 frankly, it probably would have taken a decade to get enough money together for a divorce attorney.
In the meantime, Joy resolved to keep the peace in the marriage.
I knew that I had to wait and just be patient to be able to build up enough money to have a decent divorce and provide a good life for my children.
Then that June, Joseph contacted Joy's father about visiting their home in Des Moines, Iowa with Kauai.
I think that my parents had planned on continuing a relationship with him even if we did get divorced, because, you know, he is Kauai's father and he did do a lot of things with her.
But at the last minute, Joseph canceled the trip.
He said the reason was business. There was a bounce check in the Bay Area. And how do you take care of a bounce check? That's something that's taken care of by your bank.
A few daters in Millbrae, California were busy trying to solve the Wagners' murders.
I've never seen anything as violent and as horrendous as this. I see two lifeless people laying there, people who were, coming into their golden years of their life. It shook me to the core.
At first, it appeared that the Wagners were victims of a robbery and sexual assault.
There are drawers open all around us. In the area where the bodies were located was Mrs. Wagner's underwear balled up on the couch nearby.
But something didn't add up. As investigators dug a little deeper, they uncovered evidence that suggested the killer might be someone the Wagners knew.
There didn't appear to be any kind of forced entry, so immediately we're thinking maybe the person that had done this knew the family.
Meanwhile, when Joseph arrived home later that night, it was business as usual.
He showed up at the house a couple hours later with fast food in his hand, sat down, ate his fast food, got on the computer, and then he went to the gym. He came home after the gym and went to bed and slept like a baby.
On June 15th, the following morning, Joy rolled over in bed and noticed something odd. Joseph was covered with bruises and cuts. But when Joy questioned Joseph, he had an explanation for everything.
He told me that the bruise on his shin he got while he was rollerblading, and that the horrible bruising on his hand was from a refrigerator falling on it. And I couldn't help but think, there's something wrong with these stories.
The following day, Joy headed out to meet Joseph on one of their boats with the kids, when her mom called with some shocking news.
I said they just released the cause of death. The Wagners were not shot in the head.
She held the phone out and played a live stream on their computer from a newscast, and it said that they'd been beaten to death. And that's when I knew. And I said, I know he did it. He's covered in bruises. He's the murderer.
The world stopped for just a minute. You can't catch your breath. What on earth are we going to do now? She's on her way to meet a man that she knows murdered somebody.
I was terrified. I was crying. I was pounding on the desk. I was so frightened that something would happen to her.
Joy knew she couldn't risk letting on that she suspected Joseph was a killer.
I knew the best thing to do was to go right into the eye of the storm and put on the best acting job of my life. I was going to sleep on a boat with my 3 children next to a brutal murderer.
Years into her marriage, Joy DeSombre was suddenly terrified that her husband would discover that she knew he was a killer. So she met him on the boat as planned.
And we drove on to the marina. We acted like everything was normal.
Meanwhile, Joy's mother called the tip line, but all she got was resistance.
The individual who answered the phone simply said, "This is out of my jurisdiction."
For the next 24 hours, Joy stayed with Joseph and kept up her act, hoping he wouldn't turn his rage on her and the kids.
And I continued to be the supportive wife for him, and I was terrified.
We didn't know if they'd be safe. We didn't know what would happen during the night.
Later that day, on June 17th, Joseph told Joy he was heading back upstate. Joy headed straight to the police.
I called the detectives, and they had been looking for him all week. That's when I found out that they knew very early on that he was a person of interest.
Police put out an APB on Joseph's truck, and it wasn't long before he was spotted at another marina in Southern California. Police immediately took him into custody.
I felt so much relief that he'd been caught, and our daughter and our grandchildren weren't going to be in danger.
Police charged Joseph with 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances for multiple murder. And the more investigators dug up about Joseph's life, the less Joy realized she knew about her own husband.
I found out that he was not business partners with Fernand, that he was merely a maintenance man for them. And they were paying him $525 a month for a few hours of work to collect rent checks and do some minor maintenance. He had been skimming from rent checks and keeping the money for himself, moving money from accounts, kiting checks. I was so shocked. I was devastated.
Investigators believe that by the spring of 2006, Joseph had embezzled more than $200,000 from the Wagners, and Fernand finally figured it out.
Fernand Wagner confronted Joseph Kua in his house. I think he told Joseph that knew he was stealing money from him, and he wasn't going to put up with it anymore. And something snapped in Joseph Kua's mind.
And Joseph was particularly enraged. Fernand's throat was cut. Suzanne had been strangled. Both the Wagners were brutally beaten.
He couldn't have boats and houses and cars and travel without the Wagner's money. His life, as he knew it, was over. And I think he just lost it.
Joseph himself had racked up tens of thousands of dollars in credit card debt and made faulty claims on his income taxes, leaving Joy to pick up the pieces.
The vehicles were repossessed. The house was foreclosed upon. This was emotionally and financially devastating.
On June 2nd, 2008, Joseph went to trial and pleaded not guilty.
Joseph has never admitted guilt. He claims that he's innocent and that a third party murdered the Wagners.
On June 27th, 2008, Joseph Kua was convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder.
I was so excited and so relieved. My children and I could be free of this person, and we didn't have to be afraid anymore.
On December 18th, 2008, Joy and Joseph's 5-year wedding anniversary, Joseph was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Their divorce was finalized in March 2009.
I think Joy is probably stronger than she was. She's paid a heavy price for this strength, but I think she's going to be okay.
Today, Joy and her children live with her parents and are slowly picking up the pieces.
My kids are just amazingly strong, and they're always there for me. And I hope that I've been a good example to them in how to turn this around in a positive way.
Joy is happy. She's hopeful. She's well-adjusted. She has taken a whole new direction in her life.
I'm moving on and using this as a lesson so that I can help educate others and so that I can do something really positive with what has happened in our lives. I'm not interested in dating again or getting married or anything like that or becoming serious with anybody. I think my children are significant enough, and that's, I think, how I'll live the rest of my life.
Interstate 45 stretches out like a long, dark, unending ribbon of asphalt, a vital artery of concrete that violently cuts through the landscape, connecting the sprawling, neon-lit, hyperactive metropolis of Houston to the gentle, coastal breezes of Galveston. By day, it is a symphony of constant, chaotic motion, crowded with exhausted commuters, heavy transport trucks, and hurried travelers moving with frantic purpose under the heavy, relentless Texas sun. But when the daylight begins to fade, when the blinding heat slowly gives way to the suffocating, heavy humidity of dusk, a specific stretch of this vital highway transforms into something entirely different, something fundamentally broken. The transition is subtle at first, a gradual, creeping fading away of the bright, comforting city lights, a slow encroaching of the heavy shadows that bleed out from the edges of the road. As you drive down this isolated corridor, the bustling civilization seems to retreat in the rearview mirror, leaving behind a stark, desolate landscape that feels entirely disconnected from the safety of the modern world. This is where the unforgiving pavement meets the untamed, hostile wild, where the roaring engines of passing vehicles are quickly swallowed by an overwhelming, oppressive emptiness. Just off the cracked shoulder of this busy interstate lies a place that time, grace, and humanity seem to have deliberately forgotten. It is a 25-acre expanse of desolate marshland, a sprawling, tangled, impenetrable web of overgrown weeds, thick, suffocating mud, and stagnant, dead water. There are no streetlights here to pierce the heavy darkness, no comforting glow from neighboring houses to offer a fleeting sense of safety or observation. The only sound is the low, mournful, steady howl of the wind as it whips violently through the tall, coarse grass, a sound that has served as the only continuous requiem for those who have been left behind in this unforgiving terrain. The air itself feels thick, heavy in the lungs, laden with the unmistakable, metallic scent of damp earth and the sour, pervasive, inescapable odor of stagnant, rotting water. Locals know the access point to this desolate stretch simply as Calder Road. But in the dark, blood-stained, tragic annals of American criminal history, this miserable, isolated patch of earth is known by a much more chilling, highly accurate moniker. It is the Texas Killing Fields. To truly understand the sheer, unadulterated horror of the Texas Killing Fields, one must first understand that this is not a conventional crime scene, nor does it abide by the traditional rules of criminal investigation. It is not a darkened basement, not a locked room, not a solitary, blood-spattered cabin deep in the isolated woods. It is an open, festering wound on the landscape itself, a vast, unchecked, natural abyss that has passively and silently absorbed the absolute darkest impulses of human nature for more than half a century. When we attempt to process the concept of serial killers, our minds often naturally gravitate toward the terrifying but singular narrative of a lone monster, a solitary apex predator who claims a specific, defined territory as their own personal hunting ground. The terror usually stems from the idea of one deeply disturbed mind, one consistent methodology, one singular source of pure evil systematically terrorizing a helpless community. But the reality of Calder Road shatters that conventional, comforting understanding, presenting a scenario that is infinitely more terrifying and fundamentally chaotic. The Texas Killing Fields is not the exclusive, guarded domain of a single demon. Instead, it is something far more sinister, far more incomprehensible. It is a collective graveyard, a communal, open-air dumping ground for multiple, entirely disconnected serial killers. Over the agonizing course of decades, different men, entirely unassociated with one another, driven by their own distinct, depraved, uncontrollable compulsions, looked at this exact same 25-acre stretch of desolate marshland and came to the exact same, chilling conclusion. They saw a sanctuary for their unspeakable sins. They saw a place where they could drag the broken, lifeless remnants of their victims, a place that would silently swallow their crimes and offer them absolute, unquestioned impunity. The horrifying realization that multiple predators independently gravitated toward this exact geographical spot, drawn only by its perfect, natural desolation, elevates the Killing Fields from a mere physical location to a veritable monument to human violence. It is an intersection of nightmares, a geographical anomaly where entirely different threads of pure evil converged over the span of 50 years, united only by the thick mud, the rising water, and the blanket of the dark. The tragic, heartbreaking legacy of this poison land began to take definitive shape in the 1970s, marking the sudden onset of a dark, seemingly endless era of profound sorrow for the vulnerable communities scattered along the I-45 corridor. A heavy, suffocating shadow fell over the small, quiet, unsuspecting towns bordering the highway, a creeping, pervasive dread that manifested in the most agonizing forms imaginable. Empty, perfectly made bedrooms, permanently unanswered phone calls, half-eaten dinners left on kitchen tables, and frantic, desperate, ultimately fruitless community searches. A localized epidemic of vanishings began to plague the region, a terrifying sequence of disappearances that completely defied logic and permanently shattered the illusion of suburban safety. The victims who vanished into this marshy abyss shared a hauntingly consistent, profoundly tragic profile, forming a heartbreaking tapestry of stolen youth and erased potential. They were entirely young women. Some were teenage girls, vibrant high school students with heavy backpacks and bright, unwritten futures, their young minds occupied with upcoming school dances, stressful final exams, and the innocent, fleeting complexities of adolescence. Others were single mothers, deeply determined women working tirelessly through double shifts to provide a foundation for their young children, navigating the heavy struggles of adulthood with admirable resilience and fierce hope. They were beloved daughters, cherished sisters, fiercely loyal friends, and fiercely protective mothers, all of them entirely, beautifully ordinary in their daily routines, yet irreversibly bound together by a profound, sudden, and violent tragedy. The specific circumstances surrounding their disappearances were often agonizingly mundane, emphasizing the random, fiercely predatory nature of the crimes that stole them away. They did not vanish in the dead of night from dangerous, isolated alleys or notoriously high-crime neighborhoods. Instead, many of these women and girls evaporated into thin air in broad daylight, completely surrounded by the normal, comforting hum of daily community life. A young girl innocently walking the short, highly familiar, perfectly safe distance to a local convenience store to buy a soda. A teenager casually stepping out into the warm, inviting night air after a lively, crowded party, merely intending to walk a few short blocks to her front door. A hardworking woman standing helplessly on the narrow shoulder of the interstate, looking in frustration under the smoking hood of her broken-down car, patiently waiting for a good Samaritan to pull over and offer a moment of assistance. In a fraction of a second, the entirely normal trajectory of their vibrant lives was violently, permanently interrupted. They were simply swallowed by the world, leaving behind absolutely nothing but abandoned, silent vehicles, dropped, insignificant belongings on the pavement, and devastated families instantly plunged into an unending, psychological purgatory of ambiguous loss. The only common denominator in these desperate, disjointed, chaotic cases, the only definitive thread tying these sudden vanishing acts together into a single narrative of horror, was the grim, tragic, unforgiving location of their final resting place. Over the agonizing passage of the decades, the unforgiving, hardened earth of the Texas killing fields has reluctantly, slowly surrendered its terrible, long-held secrets. One by one, more than 30 human bodies have been discovered within the muddy, tangled confines of this 25-acre graveyard. The process of discovery in this terrain is rarely swift. It is a slow, excruciating, deeply painful unveiling, entirely dictated by the unpredictable whims of the Texas environment. When the thick, choking mud is finally turned over, when the dense, thorny brush is pulled back by searching hands or the boots of wandering locals, the scenes that greet overwhelmed law enforcement officers are emphatically not the pristine, carefully preserved crime scenes depicted in television dramas. The investigators do not find fresh evidence. They find the devastating, catastrophic aftermath of time and aggressive nature acting upon fragile human remains. They find victims deeply reduced to bare skeletal remains, fragile bones bleached white by the searing summer sun or permanently stained a deep, muddy brown by the highly acidic, unforgiving soil, scattered haphazardly beneath the heavy overgrowth. They find bodies in advanced, unrecognizable stages of decomposition, unceremoniously discarded like trash in shallow, stagnant water-filled depressions or hastily, violently shoved beneath dense, impenetrable thickets of thorns. The physical state of the victims tells a silent, profoundly agonizing story of their terrifying final moments on Earth. In every single tragic instance, the inherent dignity of the victim was entirely, viciously stripped away by their captors. They were found completely devoid of their clothing, a clear, brutal, undeniable indicator of the severe sexual violence and psychological terror they endured before their lives were violently extinguished in the dark. The skeletal trauma and the scant, heavily degraded remaining forensic clues whispered devastating tales of horrific finality, young lives brutally ended by the terrifying, intimate constriction of manual strangulation or the sharp, sudden, deafening violence of a close-range gunshot. Yet, despite the staggering, horrifying sheer volume of victims pulled from the mud, justice has remained a fleeting, deeply frustrating, almost mythical concept in the killing fields, largely due to the presence of the ultimate, unbeatable accomplice in these crimes. The specific geography and the volatile climate of the Texas killing fields function as the perfect, silent, highly efficient co-conspirators for the monsters who hunted along the I-45 corridor. Nature here is actively hostile, profoundly relentless, and highly efficient at aggressively erasing the darkest sins of humanity. The marshland is perpetually submerged in shifting water, a stagnant, murky, biologically active soup that acts as a natural solvent for crucial biological material. The immense, deeply oppressive humidity of the Texas Gulf Coast significantly accelerates the natural processes of physical decay to a terrifying, almost insurmountable degree. But it is not just the stagnant water and the baking heat that work aggressively against the desperate pursuit of justice. It is the entirety of the local ecosystem. The desolate area is teeming with feral, highly active scavenging wildlife, animals that systematically disturb the delicate remains and widely scatter the bones across the acreage, further severely degrading the context and integrity of the crime scene. When a killer discarded a lifeless body in the dense, isolated brush of Calder Road, they were essentially, knowingly handing the vital evidence over to the ultimate, natural incinerator. The environment systematically, ruthlessly consumed the vital, microscopic clues absolutely necessary to build a successful legal case. The terrified perspiration left on a victim's skin during a struggle, a careless, stray fingerprint left on a discarded item of clothing, a single, microscopic strand of the attacker's hair, a tiny, revealing drop of the killer's blood, all the foundational, essential elements of modern forensic science, all the undeniable biological markers that could definitively rip the mask off a murderer, were swiftly and permanently obliterated by the wrath of the elements. Long before the local police could even arrive to solemnly string up their yellow crime scene tape, long before the bright flash of a forensic photographer's camera could briefly illuminate the heavy darkness, the swamp had already flawlessly completed the killer's dirty work. It violently washed away the trace evidence, completely dissolved the fragile DNA, and permanently silenced the surrounding environment. There were no hidden witnesses crouching in the tall grass, no modern surveillance cameras mounted on the desolate, dying trees. Without eyewitnesses to describe a cruel face, without a fleeing license plate number hastily jotted down in the dark, and without the absolute crucial biological material deeply needed to firmly tie a specific individual to the brutalized remains, the desperate investigations were practically paralyzed from the very moment they began. The dedicated detectives were left to helplessly chase formless phantoms through the thick morning fog, staring intensely at a desolate landscape that stubbornly refused to speak. Decade after heartbreaking decade, the case files grew thicker with dead ends, the grieving families grew older with unrelenting sorrow, and the tragic cases sank ever deeper into the cold, impenetrable, suffocating mud of the most notorious stretch of highway in America. To comprehend the true magnitude of the profound tragedy that permanently permeates the dense, suffocating air of the Texas killing fields, one must deliberately avert their gaze from the muddy, desolate graves and look instead toward the vibrant, deeply unfulfilled lives that were so callously, violently extinguished. It is a natural, albeit deeply flawed, human defense mechanism to reduce the victims of such unfathomable, prolonged violence to mere statistics, to view them exclusively as anonymous names etched onto sterile, clinical police reports or as the tragic, lifeless figures discovered in the overgrown brush of Calder Road. But to do so is to do a profound, unforgivable disservice to the enduring memory of those who were so brutally stolen from the world. Before they became the tragic, unwilling subjects of a sprawling, highly complex, decades-long criminal investigation, before their fundamental identities were viciously stripped away and replaced with cold, sequential case numbers, they were the absolute center of their respective, beautiful universes. They were living, breathing individuals with rich, complex inner lives, possessing their own unique ambitions, their own quiet, personal fears, and their own deeply held, highly anticipated dreams for the future. They were the comforting, familiar faces that consistently populated the small, deeply interconnected communities stretching along the bustling, concrete corridor of Interstate 45. They were an essential, irreplaceable part of the daily, comforting rhythm of these towns, their warm presence woven seamlessly into the very fabric of everyday suburban life, making their sudden, violent, entirely inexplicable removal all the more jarring and catastrophically devastating for the deeply traumatized communities they left completely behind. The victims who were ultimately, tragically claimed by the merciless, unforgiving expanse of the dense marshland shared a heartbreakingly specific, deeply vulnerable profile, one that starkly highlights the highly opportunistic, ruthlessly predatory nature of the numerous individuals who silently stalked the highway. The predators who deliberately roamed this region did not typically seek out those who were heavily guarded or deeply entrenched in high-risk, dangerous lifestyles. Instead, they preyed exclusively upon the absolute most vulnerable members of society, striking with terrifying precision at the exact moments when their victims felt the most profoundly secure and comfortable in their surroundings. Among the desperately missing were highly dedicated, profoundly resilient single mothers, women of incredible fortitude who spent their exhausting, incredibly long days expertly navigating the immense, heavy pressures of constantly providing for their beloved families. These were proud, hard-working women whose hands were worn from taking on long, demanding shifts at local neighborhood businesses, whose minds were constantly, heavily occupied with the delicate, highly stressful balancing act of paying mounting bills and fiercely nurturing their dependent children. They were incredible women who completely embodied everyday resilience, constantly moving through the difficult world with a quiet, determined, admirable grace, completely and utterly unaware that their ordinary, deeply hardworking lives would shortly intersect with unimaginable, pure cruelty. Alongside these fiercely protective mothers were the significantly younger victims, the vibrant, highly energetic, deeply innocent high school students whose entire, promising lives were just beginning to beautifully unfurl before them. These young, radiant girls were entirely, safely consumed by the innocent, fleeting, highly relatable concerns of typical adolescence. Their busy days were happily filled with the chaotic, loud energy of crowded school hallways, the nervous, highly exciting anticipation of upcoming weekend social events, the quiet, deeply treasured shared secrets whispered late at night between loyal best friends, and the profound, beautiful, entirely pure naivete of youth. They consistently looked toward their approaching adulthood with bright, unclouded optimism, completely, tragically blind to the dark, highly violent, deeply lethal undercurrents that silently, constantly flowed just a few short miles from their remarkably safe, thoroughly comfortable suburban doorsteps. The sheer, unadulterated terror of the Texas killing fields is heavily, profoundly magnified by the agonizingly ordinary, utterly mundane, entirely relatable circumstances that immediately, quietly preceded these sudden, catastrophic, life-altering vanishings. These unfortunate women and deeply innocent girls were emphatically not engaged in any form of dangerous or high-risk behaviors. They were quite simply existing, comfortably moving through the deeply familiar, highly predictable routines of their everyday, completely normal lives. The terrifying abductions occurred with a chilling, highly surgical precision, frequently taking place in broad, bright daylight, completely surrounded by the deceptive, comforting safety of their own seemingly quiet communities. A young, carefree woman might simply decide to take a short, completely routine, highly familiar walk down a quiet residential street, heading directly to the local, well-lit convenience store to quickly grab a cold drink on a remarkably sweltering, oppressive Texas afternoon, her mind entirely occupied by absolutely nothing more pressing than escaping the heavy, stagnant heat. She would casually step out of her welcoming front door, perhaps wave a friendly, familiar greeting to a passing next-door neighbor, and then, in the incredibly brief, entirely silent span of a few unsupervised, undocumented moments, she would completely, inexplicably evaporate into the thin air, leaving behind absolutely no desperate, echoing cries for urgent help, and completely lacking any physical signs of a violent, desperate physical struggle on the hot pavement. Another vibrant victim might be joyfully, sleepily walking back to her home after attending a crowded, lively, highly enjoyable neighborhood party, her heart incredibly light, completely enveloped in the warm, comforting, highly familiar embrace of a remarkably pleasant evening, only to be suddenly, violently swallowed by the absolute darkness just a few short blocks from the highly anticipated safety of her own front porch. Perhaps the most deeply terrifying, highly agonizing scenario heavily involved the unforgiving, roaring stretch of Interstate 45 itself. A highly responsible, hardworking woman, driving safely home after completing a very long, physically exhausting work shift, suddenly experiences terrifying, highly unexpected mechanical engine trouble. She responsibly, carefully pulls her smoking, completely disabled vehicle over to the narrow, highly exposed, remarkably dangerous shoulder of the fast-moving highway. As she stands helplessly by the side of the deafening, roaring interstate, anxiously, patiently waiting for a kind, generous Good Samaritan to safely pull over and immediately offer some form of helpful assistance, she inadvertently, tragically becomes the absolute perfect, entirely isolated, highly vulnerable target for a completely unhinged passing predator. In all these devastating, deeply heartbreaking scenarios, the absolute, comforting normalcy of the immediate moment was violently, permanently fractured, immediately replacing the highly comforting predictability of everyday life with an agonizing, completely permanent, utterly terrifying void. The profound, heavy depth of the immense sorrow heavily radiating from the dark eye, 45 corridor is perhaps most acutely, most painfully felt when carefully examining the truly heartbreaking, deeply disturbing cases of the absolute youngest victims, those whose innocent, incredibly brief childhoods were brutally, violently stolen in the absolute most terrifying, highly unimaginable manner physically conceivable. The highly agonizing, utterly devastating tragedy of Crystal Jean Baker stands permanently as a terrifying, deeply devastating testament to the highly ruthless, completely indiscriminate, incredibly savage nature of the extreme violence that actively plagued the entire region. In the deeply tragic year of 1996, young Crystal was merely 13 short years old, a highly vulnerable young girl standing squarely, precariously on the fragile, deeply sensitive threshold actively separating innocent childhood from approaching adolescence. Her entire world should have been exclusively defined by the highly innocent, completely carefree, joyful pursuits of her youth, heavily protected by the implicit, heavily relied upon safety net of her immediate community. Her incredibly fateful, highly tragic encounter with absolute, pure evil quietly began with an action so remarkably ordinary, so fundamentally, deeply innocent, that it makes the subsequent, horrifying tragedy almost entirely impossible for the human mind to properly emotionally process. She was quite simply utilizing a highly public, completely standard payphone, innocently reaching out through the telephone wires to connect with her loved ones, completely, utterly unaware that she was simultaneously existing directly in the dangerous crosshairs of a deeply depraved, highly observant, incredibly violent predator. In those incredibly brief, highly vulnerable, entirely isolated moments standing alone at the open telephone booth, she was violently, forcefully abducted, completely ripped away from the perceived safety of her entire world. The sheer, unspeakable horror of her incredibly terrifying final hours is permanently, deeply etched into the tragic, highly dark history of the entire geographical area. Her incredibly young, deeply fragile life was violently, mercilessly extinguished, and her highly traumatized body was carelessly, incredibly callously discarded like entirely worthless refuse beneath a large concrete bridge located in incredibly close proximity to the highly desolate, sprawling, heavily overgrown acreage of the notorious killing fields. The highly traumatic discovery of her young remains permanently, violently shattered the collective, beating heart of her entire community, immediately leaving behind a deeply devastating, entirely unfillable void and a profound, incredibly lingering, highly suffocating sense of communal guilt that such beautiful, entirely pure innocence could be so easily, so violently, so permanently erased from the world. The utterly devastating, highly tragic loss of immense youth tragically did not permanently stop with Crystal's deeply mourned passing. The remarkably devastating year of 1997 quickly brought yet another massive, highly overwhelming wave of truly unimaginable, deep agony to the heavily traumatized region with the completely horrifying, highly publicized abduction of young Laura Smither. Beautiful Laura was only 12 incredibly short years old at the time of her tragic disappearance, an incredibly tender age exclusively characterized by profound, deeply beautiful innocence and absolutely boundless, entirely untapped human potential. Her incredibly sudden, highly terrifying disappearance immediately sent massive, highly disruptive shockwaves of absolute terror and incredibly desperate, highly frantic urgency echoing loudly throughout all of the surrounding, deeply panicked towns. The deeply horrifying, utterly terrifying idea that a profoundly innocent 12-year-old child could be so violently, completely silently snatched directly from her incredibly familiar, highly safe environment, subsequently brutally murdered, and then unceremoniously abandoned in the highly hostile, incredibly unforgiving terrain of the dark marshland was a stark, highly terrifying reality entirely too horrific for the collective human mind to ever easily accept. The truly profound, highly agonizing tragedy of young Laura's deeply unfair death is inextricably, permanently linked to the incredibly dark, deeply heartbreaking, utterly devastating narratives of several other vibrant young women whose promising lives were similarly, tragically stolen by the exact same dark source of unimaginable malice, including the incredibly deeply mourned Jessica Kane and the highly cherished Kelly Cox. These women were emphatically not simply random, highly anonymous names written down on a continually expanding, incredibly tragic list. They were absolutely beloved, deeply cherished daughters whose incredibly sudden, highly violent, incredibly permanent absences completely, utterly destroyed the entire foundational stability of their profoundly grieving families. The absolutely devastated parents of these beautiful young girls were abruptly, completely without warning, forced directly into an incredibly excruciating, constantly waking nightmare, a highly permanent, deeply suffocating state of agonizing, unending limbo where absolutely every single waking moment was entirely, exhaustingly consumed by highly desperate, incredibly frantic, heavily mobilized physical searches and an overwhelmingly heavy, intensely suffocating, deeply crushing profound grief. The tragic, highly violent loss of a deeply loved child occurring under such entirely terrifying, highly brutal, profoundly dark circumstances fundamentally, permanently, and irreversibly alters the entire psychological landscape of an entire family unit, immediately leaving behind profoundly deep, entirely invisible emotional scars that absolutely no amount of passing time, and certainly no subsequent measure of delayed judicial closure, can ever completely or truly fully heal. While the immense, deeply heavy emotional pain of suddenly losing a cherished loved one to such incredibly horrific, completely senseless violence is entirely immeasurable, there permanently exists a highly specific, uniquely profound, incredibly dark layer of pure agony exclusively reserved for those highly unfortunate victims whose very names and entire identities were violently, brutally stripped away by the incredibly harsh, highly unforgiving natural environment of the deadly killing fields. For multiple, highly agonizing decades, the completely desolate, highly overgrown, deeply muddy marshland surrounding Calder Road tightly, stubbornly guarded the incredibly dark secrets of numerous, highly traumatized women who were violently, tragically reduced to the incredibly heartbreaking, deeply clinical legal status of a completely anonymous Jane Doe. To be tragically designated a Jane Doe is to completely suffer a secondary, deeply profound, incredibly offensive violation of basic human dignity. The highly brutal killer first violently, maliciously steals the innocent victim's precious life, completely stripping them of their future, and then the slow passage of time, the incredibly aggressive natural elements, and the severe, highly frustrating lack of available biological trace evidence seamlessly combine to successfully, permanently erase their given name, their entire personal history, and their fundamental, essential connection to the outside world. For the incredibly desperate, profoundly grieving families who are left completely behind, this deeply terrible reality immediately creates an entirely intolerable, decades-long, highly agonizing emotional purgatory defined exclusively by an overwhelming sense of profound ambiguous loss. They spend countless, highly exhausting years, sometimes entirely long, painful lifetimes, desperately, frantically searching the completely anonymous faces hidden within large crowds, obsessively, painfully clinging to rapidly fading, incredibly fragile threads of hope, completely and entirely unaware that their deeply beloved, highly cherished daughter, absolutely loved sister, or deeply devoted mother is actually lying completely anonymously in a highly cold, entirely sterile county morgue, or quietly buried under a completely nameless, heavily weathered stone marker. The incredibly heavy emotional toll of this highly prolonged, deeply agonizing uncertainty is absolutely devastating, functioning as a continuous, incredibly raw, heavily bleeding emotional wound that is absolutely never permitted to properly heal. It was incredibly not until the recent, highly anticipated advent of incredibly advanced, remarkably modern genealogical DNA forensic technology and incredibly complex, highly detailed facial reconstruction techniques that some of these deeply wronged, incredibly forgotten women were finally, incredibly mercifully officially given their stolen names completely back. The highly emotional, deeply staggering revelation that the incredibly tragic, very first Jane Doe pulled from the deeply muddy, highly uninviting depths of the dense killing fields was, in highly actual fact, Heidi Villarreal Fay, and the subsequent, highly emotional, deeply resonant official identification of Brenda Jones, finally provided a highly bittersweet, profoundly delayed, yet deeply necessary measure of fundamental human dignity. Restoring their deeply beautiful given names absolutely did not magically erase the highly horrific, incredibly terrifying violence of their incredibly dark final deaths, nor did it possibly mitigate the highly agonizing, profoundly long decades of incredibly deep uncertainty painfully endured by their deeply shattered families, but it finally, mercifully allowed these highly resilient women to be properly remembered not simply as completely anonymous, entirely faceless victims of a sprawling, highly monstrous, incredibly dark collective graveyard, but directly as the deeply loved, incredibly deeply missed, beautifully unique individuals they truly, fundamentally were. The profound, suffocating silence that permeated the Texas killing fields for over half a century was not merely the result of geographical isolation or the hostile, swallowing nature of the marshland. It was a testament to the absolute, terrifying efficacy of the predators who selected this patch of earth to serve as their permanent, protected dumping ground. The incidents that occurred here were rarely the clumsy, impulsive crimes of passion often depicted in lower-tier criminal fiction. Instead, the disappearances of these vibrant, young women and innocent girls along the I-45 corridor were marked by a cold, calculating, and highly deliberate pattern of predatory behavior. The monsters who stalked these roads were not searching for a fight, nor were they looking for an audience. They were searching for the absolute weakest link, a singular moment of opportunity where they could exert total, terrifying, and absolute dominance over a person whose life was in every way more precious than their own. The incident that stands as perhaps the most chilling, defining characteristic of the killing fields is not a single, isolated act of violence, but rather the haunting, recurring phantom of the perfect abduction. These kidnappings were executed with such frightening, surgical precision that they left behind almost no physical evidence, no screaming witnesses, and no discernible trail for the local authorities to follow. It is a psychological weight that sits heavily on the soul to consider how many times a predator sat patiently in an idling vehicle, eyes locked onto a target, waiting for that one specific, fatal lapse in judgment or that one cruel, unfair twist of fate, a flat tire, a missed ride, or a simple, innocent walk home, that would hand them their prey. The incident of the disappearance is often the moment of greatest horror, for in those few, final, precious seconds, the victim transitioned from a person with a future, a home, and a family to a statistic, a missing person file, and, ultimately, a dark, hidden secret buried deep in the mud. To analyze the incident is to analyze the anatomy of a nightmare. Many of the young women who vanished did so while occupying spaces that, in any rational, functional society, should have been considered entirely safe. They were not wandering through dangerous, gang-ridden urban centers in the dead of night. They were navigating the familiar, mundane geography of their daily lives. When we look at the timeline of the killing fields, we see a disturbing, consistent rhythm. A victim would disappear, often during the light of day or the early evening. There would be a brief, agonizing period of frantic searching by family members, the late-night posters stapled to telephone poles, the desperate pleas on local television, the hollow, trembling voices of mothers asking for any scrap of information. Then, there would be the cold, hollow silence that follows. The investigators would scour the area, but the landscape itself was designed to thwart them. The marshland, with its dense, tangled vegetation and deep, stagnant water, was not just a place where bodies were hidden. It was a place where the concept of a crime scene was fundamentally broken. Every incident reported in this area tells a story of an environment that worked as a silent partner to the killer. The heat, the humidity, the aggressive scavenging of the local wildlife. All of these factors combined to ensure that the window for forensic recovery was incredibly small. In the cases where the victims were eventually recovered, they were almost always found in a state that made identification nearly impossible without the aid of modern, specialized science. The incident of discovery itself was always traumatic, often occurring by pure, dumb, heartbreaking accident. A person walking their dog, a local hunter straying off the path, or a survey crew working on a new stretch of road. The internal psychological dynamic of these incidents is something that remains chilling to contemplate. These were not random acts of chance that simply happened to occur in the same place. They were the result of a predatory environment that attracted individuals who shared a specific, grotesque set of values. The killing fields became a known entity among the worst of humanity. It is entirely possible, and perhaps historically likely, that word of this desolate, unclaimed patch of land spread among predators, either through direct communication or the dark, intuitive understanding of those who operate on the fringes of societal norms. The incident of a body being dumped in the killing fields was an act of complete, utter contempt for the victim, their family, and the concept of justice. It was an assertion of power. The killer, by choosing this location, was essentially daring the authorities to find them, knowing full well that the natural conditions of the marshland made such a discovery statistically unlikely. This is what makes the investigation into these crimes so profoundly difficult. Each case was a silo. Because the bodies were so severely compromised, linking one murder to another was a logistical and forensic nightmare. For decades, the local police departments, often underfunded and overwhelmed by the sheer volume of cases along the I-45 corridor, struggled to bridge the gaps between these disparate incidents. They were dealing with a collection of cold cases that were, in many instances, as old as the investigators themselves. The tragedy is that while the authorities were struggling to find a singular thread, the evidence was literally dissolving into the mud. The incident of the abduction was the starting point of an agonizing, downward spiral for everyone involved. For the victim, it was the end of their autonomy, their safety, and their future. For the families, it was the start of an unending, psychological hostage situation. They lived in a state of suspended animation, waiting for a phone call that would either bring them a glimmer of hope or the crushing, final weight of despair. The incident of discovery brought an end to the hope, but it also replaced it with a new, equally debilitating form of trauma. To be told that your daughter's remains were found, stripped of everything that made them human, scattered in the mud like garbage, is a form of violence that words struggle to capture. It is a fundamental, irreversible rupture in the way a person views the world. And yet, this was the standard experience for the families connected to the Texas killing fields. The incident of identification, when a name was finally attached to the remains, was a moment of profound, painful closure, but it was also a reminder of the enormous amount of time that had been stolen. In some cases, families waited 20, 30, or 40 years for that moment. They grew old, their own lives were shaped by the absence of their loved ones, and they carried the grief into their own graves. The incident was never truly over. It was a continuous, evolving experience of loss. When we consider the methodology of these predators, we are forced to look at the incident of the disappearing act from a technical perspective. How did they move so seamlessly through the world, undetected, for so long? Many of these men were, by all outward appearances, completely unremarkable. They had jobs, they had homes, they had families of their own. They were the people you might pass in the grocery store aisle or see at a local park. The incident of their capture, when it eventually happened, was almost always a shock to the people who knew them. There was no monster archetype that fit them all. They were individuals who had learned to weaponize their normalcy, to use the dull, everyday routines of their lives as a camouflage for the darkness they nurtured inside. They chose the killing fields because it was the perfect hiding spot for that darkness. They understood the geography. They understood the climate. They knew that the best way to hide a tree was in a forest, and the best way to hide a murder was among a pile of other, older, forgotten, and uninvestigated murders. The incident of the crimes they committed was a betrayal of the community at every conceivable level. It was a violation of the trust that makes social cohesion possible. Every time a woman was taken, a part of the community's collective security was stripped away. The incident forced them to change the way they lived. They started locking their doors earlier, they stopped letting their children walk to the store, and they began to view strangers with a newfound, heavy, and profound suspicion. The incident of the ongoing investigation, despite the decades of frustration, has finally begun to yield some results, but at what cost? We have seen the incident of legal reckoning, where the modern tools of DNA technology and investigative genealogy have finally caught up with some of the men who terrorized the I-45 corridor. The courtrooms have seen the cold, clinical presentations of the evidence, the DNA profiles, the geographical mappings, the chilling, incriminating statements made to police. But even in these moments of judicial success, there is a lingering, haunting, and deeply unsatisfying sense of incompleteness. How can a few years of prison or even a sentence of life without parole possibly account for the magnitude of the lives that were destroyed? The incident of the verdict is merely a footnote in a story that began in the 1970s and still has many, many pages of tragedy that remain completely, entirely unwritten. We are left with the reality that for every monster captured, there are likely others whose crimes will never be solved, whose victims will never be named, and whose names will never be spoken in a court of law. The incident is not a closed book. It is a permanent, open, and bleeding wound on the landscape of Texas. It is a reminder of the fragility of our own safety, the power of nature to hide our darkest sins, and the long, slow, grinding process of seeking justice in a world that is often profoundly and tragically indifferent. We must look at these incidents not as mere horror stories, but as the foundational blocks of a collective, societal failure to protect our own, and the ongoing, necessary task of ensuring that the voices of the victims, those who were taken, those who were forgotten, and those whose stories were buried in the mud, are finally, firmly, and permanently heard. The architecture of the investigation into the Texas killing fields was, for the vast majority of its existence, a structure built on shifting sands. When the authorities first began to confront the reality that they were dealing with a systematic, recurring cycle of violence, They did not have the benefit of modern, centralized databases or the sophisticated, near-instantaneous cross-referencing capabilities that define contemporary criminal justice. Instead, they were left to navigate a landscape of disconnected paper files, fragmented jurisdictional boundaries, and the crushing, cumulative weight of time. The initial stages of the investigation were defined by a profound, almost paralyzing sense of frustration. Each discovery of remains was treated, in the immediate, desperate aftermath, as a singular, isolated event, a self-contained tragedy that required its own specific, exhaustive, and often fruitless inquiry. The detectives on the ground were dealing with a scenario that defied the traditional, linear logic of investigative work. Because the victims were discarded in such a sprawling, hostile, and volatile environment, the concept of a crime scene was, in a very real and tragic sense, a misnomer. They were not walking into a space where they could gather latent prints from a handle or preserve trace fibers from a carpet. They were, time and again, wading into a literal, biological abyss where the most essential, foundational evidence of the perpetrator's identity had already been systematically destroyed by the relentless, grinding cycle of the marshland. As the years bled into decades, the investigation evolved into an agonizing, slow-motion struggle against the inevitable decay of truth itself. One of the most significant, deeply painful, and ultimately, most challenging aspects of the investigation was the absolute lack of credible, actionable, and consistent witness testimony. Because the predators who operated in this theater of horror were so acutely aware of the protective, isolating nature of the killing fields, they naturally, methodically avoided any scenario that would risk an eyewitness encounter. They did not commit their crimes in the presence of observers. They committed them in the absolute, crushing emptiness of the dark, taking care to ensure that the final, terrifying moments of their victims' lives remained completely, utterly unobserved by any human eye. This left the investigators with a singular, incredibly difficult task. They had to build their cases entirely on the physical, biological residue that remained, and as we have explored, that residue was often, by the time of discovery, nothing more than a faint, fading shadow of a truth that had already been partially dissolved by the swamp. The process of gathering evidence was not a series of clever breakthroughs. It was a grueling, repetitive, and often heartbreaking cycle of searching through acres of mud, sifting through detritus, and hoping against all logical odds for a singular, miraculous piece of forensic DNA that had somehow survived the onslaught of the elements. It was a process that demanded a level of persistence and emotional fortitude that pushed the investigators to the very absolute limits of their professional capabilities and their own, personal, deep-seated humanity. The investigation took a dramatic and, in many ways, an entirely unprecedented turn with the emergence and eventual, widespread implementation of modern forensic science, most notably the revolutionary advent of DNA fahi, or genetic genealogy. For those long, torturous years when the victims were relegated to the status of anonymous, faceless Janes and Joses, it was this specific, highly advanced, and deeply transformative technology that eventually, mercifully, acted as the vital, flickering light in the darkness. The forensic process involved in these cases is not a simple, straightforward task. It requires the painstaking, incredibly slow, and technically demanding extraction of extremely degraded, highly sensitive, and often minute amounts of DNA from remains that have been exposed to the most severe environmental conditions imaginable for potentially decades. This is not the clean, automated science of a television procedural. It is a laborious, highly specialized craft that involves a small, dedicated army of anthropologists, geneticists, and forensic scientists who work with a level of precision that is, frankly, nothing short of miraculous. When these specialists finally managed to isolate a viable, usable genetic profile from a skeletal remain that had been sitting in the wet, acidic mud of Calder Road for 25 years, it was more than just a scientific achievement. It was a profound, deeply resonant act of reclaimed identity. It meant that a daughter who had been lost, a sister who had been forgotten, and a human being who had been treated as nothing more than a discarded piece of refuse was finally, definitively given back her name. The internal, technical struggle of the investigation was also deeply, painfully intertwined with the complex, often fractured, and ultimately highly bureaucratic nature of jurisdictional authority. The Texas killing field sits at a difficult, often contentious intersection of local, county, and state law enforcement responsibilities. For a very long time, this was a significant, structural, and deeply damaging impediment to the investigation. The coordination required to manage dozens of distinct, highly complex, and decades-old murder cases, all occurring within the same general, problematic geographical zone, was, for a long period, simply beyond the capacity of the fragmented, under-resourced departments that were forced to handle them. The breakthrough that truly, finally, allowed the investigation to gain real, forward-moving momentum was not just a technological one. It was a foundational shift in how these cases were grouped, analyzed, and prioritized. It was only when the various, overlapping investigative entities began to treat the killing fields not as a series of disparate, local problems, but as a singular, massive, and deeply interconnected, regional, criminal emergency that they began to see the patterns, the connections, and the potential for at long last, successful pursuit of justice. It was a move toward a more centralized, data-driven, and highly collaborative investigative framework, one that recognized that the magnitude of a horror was simply too great for any one department or any one set of eyes to fully, completely comprehend on their own. When we consider the pivotal, highly decisive, and in many respects, chilling case of William Lewis Reese, we are given a stark, clear, and highly illustrative look at exactly how the investigation finally, slowly, managed to break through the wall of silence that had protected these predators for so long. Reese, as a perpetrator, represented the very worst of what the killing fields had to offer. His involvement in the brutal, horrific abduction and murder of young Laura Smither in 1997 was not an isolated incident. It was a defining moment of terror for the entire region. The investigation into Reese's activities was a grueling, highly intensive, and deeply methodical process that relied on the very best of traditional police work, combined with the relentless, modern application of forensic science. For almost 2 decades, the law enforcement teams were stuck in a cycle of suspicion, gathering evidence, and hitting the brick wall of an uncooperative, highly intelligent, and deeply deceptive suspect. The breakthrough, when it finally arrived, was not just about the evidence itself. It was about the legal leverage that the authorities were finally able to, quite forcefully, bring to bear. It was the crushing, undeniable weight of DNA, combined with the extreme, lethal pressure of a potential capital sentence in another case, that finally, inexorably, forced Reese to break his long-held, stubborn silence. When he ultimately, formally, and chillingly admitted to the crimes and further, directed the investigators to the hidden, shallow, final resting places of Kelly Cox and Jessica Kane, he was not just offering a confession, he was delivering a final, damning piece of testimony that shattered the mystery that had surrounded their disappearances for so many long, excruciating, and agonizing years. This, then, is the fundamental reality of the investigation into the Texas killing fields. It is not a story of a single, lightning-fast triumph of justice. It is a story of a long, arduous, and deeply expensive war of attrition. Every single name that has been attached to the perpetrators, every single case that has been brought to at least partial, legal resolution, represents thousands of hours of work, millions of dollars in forensic, technical, and investigative resources, and a level of persistence from the involved families and the dedicated detectives that is truly, deeply, and profoundly humbling to witness. The struggle is never truly over. Even in the cases where a perpetrator has been definitively identified, tried, and sentenced, there is an overarching, lingering, and profoundly disturbing realization that remains. These individuals were operating within a wider, darker, and still, in many ways, completely invisible network of violence that was, and remains, a part of the landscape itself. The investigation today continues, powered by the incredible, modern, and continually advancing capabilities of forensic technology and motivated by the absolute, fundamental, and non-negotiable belief that every single one of those 30-plus victims deserves, at the very least, to be known, to be understood, and to have the final, brutal truth of their disappearance brought out into the open, away from the shadows of the marsh, and into the clarifying, essential light of a courtroom of law. The investigation is a tribute to their memory, a testament to the fact that no matter how long the mud has buried the truth itself, with enough time, dedication, and the right tools, will, eventually and fundamentally, rise to the surface. It is a task that is as emotionally draining as it is logistically complex, but it is a necessary, essential, and, in the final assessment, profoundly honorable obligation to the victims, their families, and the integrity of our society at large. We continue to investigate not just because the law demands it, but because the memory of those who were stolen, the memory of those who were silenced, and the memory of those who were discarded demands a response that is commensurate with the depth of the horror that they so tragically and so unfairly had to endure in their final moments of life. The judicial landscape surrounding the Texas killing fields is a testament to the immense difficulty of achieving legal finality in a region defined by such profound evidentiary challenges. When a case finally reaches the threshold of the courtroom, it is not merely a trial of an individual. It is an attempt to reconstruct a reality that has been meticulously dismantled by time, environmental degradation, and the calculated silence of the accused. The process of prosecution in these matters is an exhaustive, emotionally fraught endeavor that requires an unprecedented integration of forensic data, psychological profiling, and the raw, heartbreaking testimonies of those who have spent decades waiting for a moment of legal acknowledgement. Every trial that has successfully resulted in a conviction for a crime associated with the I-45 corridor represents a hard-fought victory for the state, a rare and precious instance where the overwhelming, murky chaos of the marshland was successfully distilled into the clear, undeniable standards of judicial proof. The courtroom, in these instances, becomes the only place where the narrative can finally be wrested from the darkness and placed under the harsh, uncompromising scrutiny of the law. Take, for instance, the complex and deeply technical path to the conviction of Kevin Edison Smith, a case that serves as a cornerstone for how modern forensics can act as an instrument of justice long after the original crime has occurred. The prosecution of Smith was not built on the shifting, unreliable sands of circumstantial rumor or the fading, easily challenged memories of human witnesses. It was anchored entirely, immovably, in the cold, precise language of DNA analysis. When investigators finally possessed the technological capability to examine the microscopic biological evidence that had been recovered from the clothing of Crystal Jean Baker, evidence that had sat in cold storage for nearly 2 decades, they were not looking for a general connection. They were seeking a genetic fingerprint that could only belong to one individual. The trial of Kevin Edison Smith was a masterclass in the intersection of science and advocacy. The legal team, representing both the interests of the state and the enduring, profound grief of the Baker family, had to present a mountain of complex, often dry, and highly technical scientific data in a way that resonated with the jury on a fundamental, human level. They had to demonstrate that the trace amount of DNA found on Crystal's shirt was not a matter of coincidental contamination or some minor, easily explained interaction, but was, in fact, the final, permanent link between the victim's final moments of terror and the perpetrator's deliberate, predatory actions. The courtroom atmosphere during such trials is almost always thick with an unspoken, suffocating weight. For the families of the victims, the trial is a surreal, often dissociative experience. They are forced to sit, day after agonizing day, in a room with the individual who systematically dismantled the most precious part of their world. They must listen to the dispassionate, clinical, and often brutal descriptions of the forensic findings, the exact nature of the injuries, the state of the remains, the calculated, cold-blooded movements of the killer, all while maintaining a composure that defies the sheer scale of the internal, personal destruction they are feeling. The prosecution must carefully manage this, ensuring that the jury is presented with the stark reality of the crime without succumbing to a tone that could be perceived as overly inflammatory or prejudicial. It is a razor-thin line to walk. They must be cold, precise, and objective in their delivery of the evidence, yet they must also ensure that the human element of the tragedy, the life that was stolen, the future that was erased, is not entirely lost in the mountain of genetic reports and technical summaries. This is where the true, often invisible, skill of the prosecution lies, the ability to weave the forensic facts into a coherent, devastating narrative of accountability. In the proceedings against William Lewis Reese, the legal strategy was fundamentally different and infinitely more dangerous. Because Reese was already facing the ultimate, terrifying penalty of capital punishment in another jurisdiction, his trial for the murders of Kelly Cox and Jessica Kane became a high-stakes, multi-dimensional exercise in legal negotiation and tactical pressure. The authorities knew that to bring the full weight of justice down upon him for the Killing Fields crimes, they had to leverage every existing, confirmed piece of evidence they possessed. The legal proceedings were not just about the trial itself. They were about the psychological and strategic campaign to force a confession. The prosecution had to navigate a delicate, highly precarious dance. They had to build a case that was, in itself, airtight, while simultaneously presenting Reese with a reality where his only hope of a negotiated outcome was to cooperate. The ultimate, chilling result, Reese's detailed confession and his guidance to the sites where he had hidden the remains of his victims, was the culmination of a legal strategy that spanned years. When the trial finally proceeded, it was a formality of justice, a public, official acknowledgement of a reality that the investigators had been building toward for nearly 2 decades. The sentencing phase, while providing a degree of legal closure, also served as a stark reminder of how long, how difficult, and how fundamentally inefficient the pursuit of justice is when the perpetrator has already successfully evaded detection for such a significant portion of their own life. The role of the judge and the jury in these cases is equally critical and often overlooked. A jury in a case involving the Texas Killing Fields is not simply tasked with determining the guilt of an individual based on the presentation of evidence. They are tasked with the almost impossible burden of being the final arbiters of a mystery that has plagued their community for a lifetime. They have to sit in judgment of crimes that possess a level of cruelty that, for many, is profoundly difficult to reconcile with the normal, functioning world. The defense, in these cases, often focuses on the potential for reasonable doubt, pointing to the decades of time that have passed, the degradation of the physical environment, and the possibility of contamination of evidence. The prosecution must proactively and systematically deconstruct these arguments, reinforcing the reliability of the forensic techniques being used and grounding the entire legal narrative in the indisputable, immutable truth of genetic markers. It is a grueling, mental, and emotional endurance test for everyone involved in the process, from the bailiffs to the court reporters, and perhaps most intensely for the families who must watch it all unfold. Every motion, every objection, and every piece of testimony is a battle over the final, official record of history. The outcome of these legal battles, even in the instances where a guilty verdict is delivered and a sentence is handed down, rarely feels like a victory in the traditional, triumphal sense. There is no joy in the courtroom when a man is sent to prison for the rest of his life for the murder of a 13-year-old girl. There is only a cold, somber, and profound sense of relief that the legal truth has finally been established. The jury, having rendered their verdict, often leaves the courtroom with a weight that they will carry for the rest of their lives. They have looked into the darkest, most hidden recesses of human nature and have, in the name of the state, officially labeled it for what it is. The judgment, in this case, is not just about the individual sitting at the defense table. It is a judgment on the concept of accountability itself. It serves as a necessary, essential reinforcement of the idea that no matter how well a crime is hidden, no matter how perfectly a landscape is used to shield a perpetrator from the eyes of society, the law, combined with the tireless, unyielding dedication of those who serve it, will eventually and fundamentally find a path to the light. It is the only real, tangible defense that society has against the persistent, encroaching darkness of the killing fields. Yet, we must be honest about the limitations of this legal resolution. Every conviction, every trial, and every guilty verdict only ever addresses a single thread in a much larger, darker, and more complex tapestry of violence. The courtrooms in Texas have seen the end of a few, very specific, very devastating stories, but they have yet to see the end of the entire, sprawling narrative of the killing fields. The legal process is, by its very design, reactive. It can only address what is brought before it, what is discovered, what is identified, and what can be proven to the absolute, rigorous standard of the law. It cannot reach into the dark, hidden, and likely forever undiscovered graves of the remaining victims whose lives were also stolen along the I-45 corridor. It cannot reach the perpetrators who may have died before they could ever be brought to justice, or those who continue to live in total, absolute impunity, hidden in plain sight, protected by the secrets they hold, and the failure of the environment to surrender its final, remaining clues. The legal finality, then, is a qualified one. It is a necessary, fundamental, and essential step, but it is not the final chapter. It is the process by which we honor the victims whose stories we have finally managed to piece together, while at the same time acknowledging the profound, aching reality of the many more whose stories may, tragically, never see the interior of a courtroom. It is a constant, ongoing, and vital dialogue between our desire for ultimate justice and the reality of a world that is, far too often, content to keep its most horrific secrets buried in the deep, silent mud of a Texas marsh. The legacy of the Texas killing fields is not merely an accumulation of tragic statistics or a series of successfully closed cold cases. It is a profound, permanent, and deeply unsettling scar upon the collective consciousness of the American public and the law enforcement community that continues to grapple with its enduring shadow. As the years have unfolded, the physical landscape of the area once defined by its absolute, suffocating isolation has begun to change. The encroaching sprawl of suburban development, the relentless expansion of new roads, and the persistent march of urban modernization have gradually, partially, and ironically sanitized the notorious stretch of Calder Road. What was once a desolate, hidden, and impenetrable sanctuary for predators is now, in many places, bordered by the bright, bustling, and mundane reality of houses, shopping centers, and busy streets. Yet, this transformation, while visually reassuring, does absolutely nothing to resolve the fundamental, lingering, and profoundly haunting questions that define the essence of this place. The killing fields, in its historical reality, remains an open wound, a place where the barrier between the mundane world and the absolute, terrifying depths of human depravity was once terrifyingly, consistently, and violently breached. For those who were deeply and irrevocably touched by these crimes, the surviving families, the detectives who spent their entire professional lives searching for answers in the mud, and the residents of the I-45 corridor who remember the fear that once defined their daily lives, the past is not a settled, tidy, or completed history. It is a constant, recurring, and deeply painful presence that refuses to be fully buried, just as the victims themselves were never truly, properly allowed to rest. When we reflect upon the broader implications of the Texas killing fields, we are confronted with the deeply uncomfortable reality of our own societal vulnerability. It is a mistake to view these events as a localized, historical curiosity, a strange and terrifying anomaly that belongs exclusively to a specific, bygone era of Texas. Instead, the killing fields serve as a stark, unavoidable, and universal reminder of the fragility of the safety we so often take for granted. The predators who operated here were not born from a vacuum. They were products of the same world we inhabit, individuals who successfully weaponized the very systems of routine, privacy, and normalcy that we use to structure our own safe lives. The ease with which they were able to act, the length of time they were able to maintain their terrifying double lives, and the brutal efficiency with which they utilized the natural environment to shield their actions are all indicators of a profound, systemic failure of vigilance. We are forced to ask ourselves difficult, uncomfortable, and necessary questions about how much we truly know about the people who move through the spaces we share, how much of our perceived safety is based on reality, and how much is merely a comforting, shared illusion. The killing fields, in this sense, acts as a permanent, cautionary mirror, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable possibility that the most dangerous threats to our peace are often the ones that are most effectively hidden within the plain, everyday sight of our communities. The pursuit of justice in the aftermath of these crimes has evolved into a long, arduous, and deeply expensive process of reclaiming identity. The recent, profound successes in identifying victims through the application of advanced, modern genetic genealogy and sophisticated, forensic facial reconstruction are not just scientific victories. They are, in the most essential sense, acts of restorative justice. Each time a name is returned to a Jane Doe, a portion of the dignity that was so violently stolen from her is, at last, restored. It is an acknowledgement that her life, her history, and her memory matter, and that no amount of time, no matter how vast or how corrosive, can fully erase her significance from the world. For the families who have waited decades in an agonizing state of perpetual limbo, this process is the only possible path toward a measure of internal peace. It does not replace the loss. It does not bring back the vibrant, stolen future of a daughter or a sister, and it certainly does not provide a simple, immediate fix for the profound, life-altering grief that has defined their existence for so long. However, it does finally provide an answer. It ends the agonizing, daily uncertainty that is often far more debilitating than the final, crushing weight of a definitive, tragic truth. To know, even in the most heartbreaking, devastating way, is a fundamentally different and arguably more humane experience than to forever, hopelessly, and frantically wonder. Yet, as we consider the ongoing and necessary work that remains, we must acknowledge that for every victim whose story has been brought into the light, there are many others whose stories remain, for the time being, irrevocably lost in the silence of the mud. This is the enduring, agonizing reality of the killing fields. It is a monument not just to the few who were caught, but to the many who were never identified, and the even greater number of perpetrators who were never caught. We must maintain a perspective of profound, unwavering humility when we discuss the resolution of these cases. We have not conquered the darkness. We have simply, slowly, and with great difficulty, managed to illuminate a few small, scattered patches of it. There is an ongoing, deep, and essential duty to continue the investigation, to continue the research, and to continue the application of new, innovative forensic technologies to the remains that are still held in storage, waiting for their own, future moment of identification. This is a commitment that must be made not just by the current, dedicated teams of investigators, but by the society that demands a standard of justice that does not expire with the passage of time or the degradation of physical evidence. We owe it to the victims to ensure that their stories do not end in the swamp, and that their final, agonizing experiences are not the ultimate, definitive statement on their existence. The emotional and psychological toll on the communities bordering the I-45 corridor is something that will, in all likelihood, never be fully calculated. Entire generations have grown up under the long, dark shadow cast by the reputation of the killing fields. They have been taught, from a very early age, to look at the world with a heightened, constant level of suspicion and caution. The collective trauma of the region is a tangible, living thing, a part of the local history that is passed down through shared memories, news reports, and the enduring, whispered stories of the families who are directly and violently affected. To move forward as a community, the people of this region must find a way to reconcile the reality of this dark, horrific history with the hope for a future that is defined by something other than fear. This requires a process of collective healing, an acknowledgement of the profound loss that has occurred, and a commitment to creating an environment that is genuinely, structurally, and fundamentally safer for everyone who lives there. It is a process that is as challenging as it is necessary, and it is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit that, despite the overwhelming, dark, and lingering trauma of the past, these communities have continued to thrive, to grow, and to look, with a guarded but persistent sense of hope, toward the future. Ultimately, the story of the Texas killing fields is a story about the intersection of the human capacity for extraordinary evil and the equally powerful, enduring human capacity for persistent, stubborn, and profoundly necessary hope. It is a narrative that forces us to reconcile the most devastating aspects of our nature with our highest, most essential values. We are compelled to look, even when we would much rather turn away. We are compelled to remember, even when the memory itself is a source of intense, physical and psychological pain, and we are compelled to continue the work of justice, even when the odds are stacked against us and the truth seems hopelessly, permanently obscured. The victims of the killing fields deserve to be remembered not as the tragic, anonymous subjects of a long-running, depressing, and sensationalized true crime saga, but as the unique, vibrant, and cherished individuals they truly were, whose lives were stolen in an act of profound and entirely inexcusable violence. Their memory is the responsibility of us all. It is a charge that requires us to be more vigilant, more compassionate, and more committed to the protection of the most vulnerable among us. We carry their stories forward, not because we seek the macabre thrill of the hunt, but because we recognize the fundamental, human dignity that is at stake. The mud may have held the truth for a long, long time, but it has not, in the end, proven stronger than our need to understand, our need to acknowledge, and our need to, at long, long last, bring the light of justice to the very edges of the dark. The journey toward total resolution is likely, and tragically, a path that we will never reach the end of, but it is a path that we must, nevertheless, continue to walk with an unwavering, solemn, and profound sense of purpose, ensuring that the legacy of those who were lost is never, ever again reduced to the silence of an empty, neglected, and forgotten field. The narrative of the Texas killing fields, when viewed through the lens of the decades that have passed since the first grim discoveries, transcends the boundaries of typical true crime reporting and enters the realm of a broader, deeper sociological investigation into the nature of memory, loss, and the slow, relentless pursuit of accountability in an indifferent landscape. As we look toward the horizon of the future, it is essential to consider not only the cases that have been resolved but also the persistent, unanswered questions that remain embedded in the very fabric of this region. The process of confronting such a prolonged, collective trauma is inherently incomplete. There is no neat, final ending to a story that spans half a century, involving scores of victims, multiple perpetrators, and a forensic process that is perpetually catching up to the innovations of the present. The killing fields represent a persistent, unresolved challenge to our modern understanding of criminal justice, a reminder that the systems we rely upon to ensure safety and provide closure are often, in reality, fragile, reactive, and profoundly limited by the very environment they are intended to protect. This reflection is not intended to diminish the monumental efforts of the investigators who have labored for years to piece together the shattered remnants of these lives. Rather, it is a call to recognize the immense, ongoing weight of the work that remains, and the necessity of keeping the voices of the forgotten at the forefront of our collective awareness. One of the most striking aspects of the killing fields narrative is the way in which the environment itself has functioned as a primary antagonist in the investigative process. Throughout our exploration, we have seen how the marshland, with its dense, tangled vegetation and stagnant, acidic waters, was weaponized by those who sought to conceal their atrocities. This relationship between the perpetrator and the terrain is something that warrants a deeper level of analytical attention as we move forward. The modern landscape, now significantly altered by the pressures of urban expansion, serves as a testament to our ongoing, human attempt to impose order and development upon a space that was once defined by its resistance to such efforts. Yet, as the asphalt replaces the mud and the housing developments slowly cover the once desolate acreage, we must ask ourselves whether this physical transformation actually mitigates the horror of what transpired, or if it merely serves to obscure it beneath a veneer of modern progress. The memory of the killing fields is etched not just in the official case files of the police departments, but in the psychological landscape of the communities themselves, where the history of these disappearances is intertwined with the everyday experience of life along the I-45 corridor. The evolution of forensic technology, which we have identified as the single most critical factor in the recent successes of these investigations, continues to offer a glimmer of hope that the future may yield more answers than the past ever could. The field of genetic genealogy is rapidly advancing, moving beyond the limitations that hindered earlier, more primitive attempts at identification. As these techniques become more sophisticated, accessible, and integrated into the standard operational procedures of law enforcement, the likelihood of resolving additional, long-standing cold cases increases significantly. This is a profound, technological frontier that offers the possibility of providing families with the answers they have been denied for generations. However, we must also recognize that technology, no matter how advanced, is not a panacea. It requires a dedicated, institutional commitment to applying these tools to cold cases that are, by their very nature, complex, resource-intensive, and often difficult to prioritize in the face of current, active criminal threats. The preservation of the remaining evidence, the ongoing maintenance of relationships with the families of the victims, and the persistent desire to see these cases through to the end are all fundamental, human components of the process that technology can support, but never fully replace. When we consider the families who have been at the center of this tragedy, we see a level of resilience that is as humbling as it is heartrending. For these individuals, the journey toward justice has been a lifetime engagement, a pursuit that has shaped their identities and defined their relationships with their own communities. Their commitment to keeping the names of their loved ones in the public sphere, their patience in waiting for the slow, grinding machinery of the legal system to turn, and their enduring hope that the truth would eventually emerge, constitute a form of quiet, persistent heroism that deserves to be recognized. It is because of their unwavering advocacy that the killing fields never faded into the obscurity that the perpetrators so clearly desired. They have served as the moral anchor of the investigations, ensuring that the authorities were constantly reminded of the human cost of the unresolved cases and the imperative of continuing the search for the truth. Their collective memory, preserved in stories, photographs, and the persistent annual observances of those who are lost, is the most powerful weapon we possess against the darkness that the marshland sought to permanently preserve. As we conclude this detailed, exhaustive, and deeply somber examination of the Texas killing fields, we must ultimately recognize that our task is one of ongoing remembrance and steadfast vigilance. The story of the killing fields is not a static event that occurred entirely in the past. It is a dynamic, evolving reality that continues to influence the lives of those who inhabit the region today. It is a story that requires us to be sensitive to the lingering presence of trauma, the necessity of continued, forensic-driven inquiry, and the fundamental, ethical obligation to prioritize the search for truth over the convenience of a cold, unresolved file. We look back at the history of these events with a profound, aching sense of loss, but we also look forward with a determination to ensure that the patterns of the past are not repeated and that the mechanisms of justice are continually strengthened to protect those who are most at risk of being forgotten. The commitment to this cause is one that transcends the specific circumstances of the Texas killing fields, becoming a broader statement about the values of our society, the importance of individual identity, and the non-negotiable belief that every life, no matter how violently or unfairly it was stolen, possesses a dignity that remains intact long after the physical evidence has been lost to the mud. The final, essential takeaway from this investigation is that the process of justice is, in the final analysis, an act of defiance against the cruelty that sought to render these women and girls entirely invisible. By naming them, by documenting their lives, by analyzing the failures that allowed these crimes to continue for so long, and by persistently working to identify those responsible, we are actively rejecting the darkness of the killing fields. We are affirming that the memories of the victims are stronger than the environment that was used to hide them, and that the truth, when pursued with enough dedication and the right tools, will eventually emerge from the shadows. This is a journey that will likely continue for many more years, as the remaining evidence is analyzed and the collective, societal efforts to seek answers are sustained. It is a journey that demands our continued attention, our empathy, and our firm, unrelenting support for the pursuit of justice. The killing fields will always remain a dark, haunting, and tragic chapter in the history of the United States, but it is also a chapter that serves to define our collective response to the presence of absolute, incomprehensible evil. It reminds us that while we cannot prevent the existence of monsters, we can, through our unified, societal commitment to justice, ensure that they are eventually found, that they are held accountable, and that the voices of their victims are, at long last, lifted out of the silence and into the light where they so rightfully belong. As we close this narrative, we find ourselves standing in the same metaphorical space, as those who have spent their lives trying to understand the events along the I-45 corridor. We're looking back at the swamp, recognizing its terrible power, and firmly deciding that we will no longer let it define the identities of those who were taken from us. We carry the stories of these victims, their laughter, their dreams, their families, and their stolen potential, forward into the future, ensuring that the memory of their lives remains a powerful, active force in our world. We have explored the history of the killing fields, from the initial, desperate days of confusion to the modern, forensic-driven breakthroughs that have begun to bring a measure of, albeit incomplete, justice to the families of the victims. This exploration has been a deeply challenging and necessary undertaking, one that has required us to look into the abyss of human violence and maintain our focus on the humanity that resides at the heart of the tragedy. In doing so, we have honored the memory of those who were lost, and we have reaffirmed the importance of our own, collective, and ongoing search for the truth in a world that is all too often, and all too tragically, quick to forget the lives that have been left behind. The journey does not end here, but the path forward is clearer, illuminated by the, at long last, returning light of knowledge, remembrance, and the persistent, unyielding pursuit of justice for every single victim who was once, and forever will be, known as a part of the Texas killing fields. The enduring legacy of the Texas killing fields represents a singular, devastating juncture where the extreme volatility of human malice intersected with the cold, indifferent silence of the natural world. As we have meticulously retraced the path from the initial, haunting disappearances of the 1970s to the recent, forensic-driven resolutions of the modern era, we are left with a landscape that is both physically transformed and permanently haunted. The marshes bordering Interstate 45 are no longer the quiet, impenetrable voids they once were. They are now inscribed with the memories of those who were lost and the collective, heavy awareness of the cruelty they endured. This final reflection is not an attempt to provide a sense of false closure to a series of events that are, by their very nature, deeply, irrevocably open, but rather an effort to synthesize the profound, lingering implications of what occurred along that stretch of road. The killing fields stand as an indelible mark on the psyche of the American justice system, a case study in the systemic vulnerabilities that allowed such an extended, catastrophic failure of protection to occur, and an ongoing testament to the immense, agonizingly slow process of reclaiming identity in the wake of such total, dehumanizing violence. The transition from the era of unchecked, invisible predation to the current age of accountability is perhaps the most significant, transformative narrative arc of this entire saga. For decades, the predators who utilized the marshland operated under the arrogant, lethal assumption that the environment would always, reliably, serve as their accomplice. They believed that by discarding their victims in the mud, they were effectively discarding the truth itself. They banked on the inefficiency of the authorities, the fragmentation of local law enforcement, and the relentless, aggressive decay inherent to the humid, coastal Texas climate. And for a long, painful time they were correct. The silence of the killing fields was not just a lack of witnesses, it was a structural feature of the investigative landscape. It was only through the long, grinding accumulation of dedicated human effort, combined with the unprecedented, paradigm-shifting advancements in forensic science, that this silence was finally, partially, and definitively broken. We have seen how the integration of genetic genealogy, which allows for the identification of victims even when the physical remains have been severely compromised by time and nature, has become the essential, modern key to unlocking the secrets of the swamp. It is a profound, technological victory that speaks to our refusal to let the darkness have the final word. However, we must temper this recognition of progress with a sobering, grounded awareness of the work that remains. The cases that have been resolved, the identification of Heidi Vireal-Fay, the conviction of William Lewis Reese, the legal reckoning of Kevin Edison Smith, are not merely data points, they are hard-won battles against the permanent, encroaching weight of forgetting. Yet, for every victim who has finally been given a name and every perpetrator who has finally been brought to account, there are numerous others whose stories remain trapped in the limbo of unresolved investigations. The reality of the Texas killing fields is that it was not a singular, unified crime but a collection of horrific, individual tragedies that happen to share a single, devastating geographic coordinate. This complexity is what makes the pursuit of justice so fundamentally, excruciatingly difficult. The authorities are not just tracking one shadow, they are tracking a multitude of phantoms, some of whom have long since passed away, some of whom may still be living among us, and all of whom operated with the chilling, lethal advantage of an environment that was designed to protect them. The ongoing commitment to these investigations is not a choice. It is an obligation to the victims and their families, a commitment that must be sustained regardless of how many decades have passed or how much the original trail has gone cold. The role of the grieving families throughout this saga cannot be overstated. They have been the true, unyielding sentinels of the truth, the ones who kept the stories of their missing daughters and sisters alive when the world seemed ready to move on. Their resilience in the face of such profound, life-altering loss is a standard of fortitude that is both humbling and deeply, painfully necessary. They have navigated the bureaucratic labyrinth of multiple police departments, the agonizing, periodic reports of new remains, and the traumatic, public re-exposure that comes with every new lead and every new, difficult trial. Their persistence has forced the hands of the authorities, reminding them that behind every cold case file, there is a person whose life was filled with potential, who was loved deeply, and whose absence is a constant and heavy weight upon the hearts of their surviving loved ones. This, in the end, is the most powerful, persistent force in the story of the Killing Fields. It is the refusal of the families to let their loved ones be reduced to the anonymity of the swamp. Their continued advocacy and their enduring, often silent, courage serve as the moral foundation upon which all of the recent, hard-won successes in these cases have been built. As we look toward the future, we must ensure that the lessons of the Texas Killing Fields are deeply, irrevocably integrated into our broader, societal approach to the prevention of and the investigation into violent crime. We have learned that the vulnerability of our communities is often a result of our own, collective, and sometimes willful, blindness to the threats that exist on the fringes of our ordinary, comfortable lives. We have learned that the protection of the vulnerable, especially those who are disproportionately targeted by predators, must be a primary and constant concern, and that our systems of law enforcement must be capable of recognizing patterns of violence even when they occur across different jurisdictions and over long stretches of time. We have learned that the advancement of forensic science is not just an academic endeavor. It is a vital, essential tool for the preservation of justice, one that must be supported, funded, and aggressively applied to cases that have been neglected for far too long. The Killing Fields have taught us that while we cannot eliminate the presence of evil, we can, through our unified, societal determination, drastically reduce its ability to operate in the shadows, and we can, ultimately, ensure that its victims are never, ever forgotten. The emotional geography of this region has been permanently, irrevocably altered by the events of the last half-century. While new buildings may rise and roads may be paved over the sites where victims were once discovered, the consciousness of the community remains linked to the memory of the past. This is not necessarily a negative, regressive burden. It can also be a source of strength and a catalyst for change. The awareness of what happened along the I-45 corridor is a constant and necessary reminder of the importance of community vigilance, the necessity of mutual support among neighbors, and the critical, essential nature of our ongoing, collective commitment to the truth. By acknowledging the reality of the past, we are better equipped to navigate the challenges of the future, ensuring that the environments we live in are places where safety, respect, and the fundamental, inherent dignity of every individual are protected with the utmost and unwavering care. The Killing Fields were once a place of silence and death. It is our collective and ongoing task to ensure that they are, instead, a place of memory, of reflection, and of an enduring and vital commitment to the pursuit of justice. In conclusion, the story of the Texas Killing Fields is one that must be told, and told again, with the same level of precision, empathy, and unyielding focus that we have brought to this examination. It is a story that defies the simple, comforting, and often deceptive narratives of traditional crime media. It is a complex and deeply messy reality that refuses to be neatly packaged or, finally, resolved. We must continue to follow the leads, support the scientists, honor the families, and keep the memory of the victims alive in every way and manner possible. We do this not because it is easy, but because it is right. We do this because the alternative, the silence, the apathy, and the final erasure of the lives that were stolen, is a defeat of everything that we claim to value as a society. The swamp may have attempted to bury these lives, but it has not, in the end, proven stronger than the persistent and powerful call of justice. The stories of those who were lost in the Texas killing fields will continue to echo through the halls of our legal institutions, through the deep and enduring love of their families, and through the collective and shared conscience of a nation that is finally beginning to fully understand the weight of what occurred along the dark and tragic stretch of Interstate 45. Their names are the foundation of our memory, and their justice is the ultimate and necessary goal of our work. We move forward, carrying the weight of their loss and the hope of their remembrance until the final and necessary light has reached every dark corner of the field that once believed it could hide the truth forever. The final contemplative perspective on the Texas killing fields must acknowledge that the project of memory is as demanding as the project of justice itself. Throughout these 8 chapters, we have traversed the dark history of the I-45 corridor, examining the mechanics of the crimes, the evolution of forensic science, the profound suffering of the families, and the long, grinding process of legal accountability. Yet, as we stand at this concluding juncture, it becomes clear that there is no tidy, literary resolution to be found in the reality of the killing fields. The story is a living one, constantly being updated by new forensic discoveries, the passing of time, and the shifting landscape of the region. To understand the significance of this place, we must look beyond the immediate facts of the murders and consider what the long-term existence of such a site says about our societal capacity to confront the most extreme manifestations of human violence. The killing fields were not just a location for atrocities. They were a systemic failure, a place where the infrastructure of justice, the oversight of law enforcement, and the very concept of communal safety collapsed under the weight of an environmental and procedural void. To ensure that such a collapse does not recur, we must continue to engage with the uncomfortable history of this region, not as a closed book, but as an ongoing, essential dialogue about the fragility of our own protections. The transformation of the killing fields from an active, overlooked dumping ground into a memorialized space of historical trauma has been an arduous, decades-long process. It has required the persistent labor of detectives who refused to let the cases die, the tireless advocacy of families who demanded their missing loved ones be remembered, and the advancements of a scientific community that turned the marshland's final, remaining clues into instruments of identification. This transformation is a testament to the resilience of the human drive for truth. It suggests that even in environments designed to foster anonymity and silence, the truth has a gravitational pull that, given enough time, energy, and resources, will eventually overcome the efforts of those who seek to bury it. We have witnessed how the application of modern DNA technology has not only provided legal closure in specific instances, but has also fundamentally altered the power dynamic between the predator and the community. The ability to reclaim identity from the mud has effectively neutralized the primary advantage that these killers sought to exploit: the ability to strip away the victim's name and history. By returning these names, we have reclaimed the victim's humanity, and in doing so, we have significantly diminished the perceived impunity of the killers who once moved through the corridor with the cold confidence that they would never be unmasked. As we look toward the future, the primary challenge is to maintain the momentum of these investigative efforts without allowing the intensity of the commitment to diminish. We must guard against the complacency that often follows the successful resolution of a few high-profile cases. The reality of the killing fields is that the resolution of a singular case is only a victory in a much larger, ongoing conflict against the conditions that allowed such extensive violence to persist for half a century. We must foster a culture of vigilance that recognizes the signs of predatory behavior, that understands the importance of cross-jurisdictional collaboration, and that remains deeply invested in the long-term, nonlinear work of solving cold cases. This commitment must be reflected in the policies of our legal institutions, the funding of our forensic labs, and the continued, active support of our communities for the families who are still waiting for answers. We cannot allow the progress that has been made to be treated as the end of the road. Rather, it must be viewed as the baseline from which we build a more robust, proactive, and resilient framework for justice. The emotional legacy of the killing fields remains as profound today as it was in the earliest days of the investigation. For those who live along the I-45 corridor, the memory of these crimes is a tangible part of their local reality. It is a presence that influences the way they move through their world, the way they perceive their environment, and the way they relate to their neighbors. We must be respectful of this enduring, collective experience, recognizing that the trauma does not simply evaporate with the passing of decades or the successful prosecution of a suspect. It is a part of the history of this region, and it should be acknowledged as such, not through the lens of sensationalism, but through a lens of profound and sustained communal compassion. We must continue to support the initiatives that aim to memorialize the victims in a way that centers their lives and their identities, rather than the horrific, violent circumstances of their deaths. This is a subtle but essential shift in focus that helps to decouple the memory of the person from the memory of the crime, allowing the victim to be remembered as the individual they were, rather than as a permanent, tragic subject of a criminal case file. In contemplating the future of forensic inquiry, we must also recognize the importance of keeping the door open to innovation. The same technological breakthroughs that allowed us to identify Heidi Villarreal-Fay and Brenda Jones were, at one time, entirely unimaginable to the investigators who first walked the muddy paths of Calder Road. This suggests that there is tremendous, untapped potential in the evidence that is currently sitting in storage, waiting for the next generation of scientific advancement to reveal its secrets. We must protect this evidence with the same level of care that we would afford any other vital, historical asset, ensuring that it remains accessible, preserved, and ready for future analysis. The dedication to this task is a fundamental and necessary part of the commitment to the victims, recognizing that the passage of time does not render their cases any less urgent, and that the search for justice is not defined by a statute of limitations. We must remain curious, persistent, and open to the possibility that the truth is still waiting to be discovered, hidden in the very materials that were once thought to be completely and utterly useless. The lessons that we have derived from the Texas killing fields are universal, extending far beyond the specific, tragic history of the Houston-Galveston region. They speak to the core of what it means to live in a society that values the life, dignity, and memory of every individual. They remind us that the darkness of our world is not something that we can simply hope will pass, but something that we must actively and consistently work to illuminate through the pursuit of truth and the maintenance of justice. The killing fields, in their long, silent, and haunting history, have become a mirror that reflects the very best and the very worst of our societal impulses, the capacity for incomprehensible, cold-blooded cruelty, and the capacity for persistent, stubborn, and profoundly necessary hope. By choosing to remember, by choosing to search, and by choosing to act, we are affirming the values that we hold most dear. We are saying that no life is too small to be forgotten, and that no grave, no matter how deep, how muddy, or how distant, is beyond the reach of our determination to find the truth. As we conclude this exploration, we carry with us the heavy and essential knowledge of what transpired along this stretch of highway. We carry the stories of the victims, the efforts of the investigators, and the suffering of the families. We understand that this is not a history that can be compartmentalized or finished. It is a history that must be held, acknowledged, and addressed with a level of seriousness and commitment that matches the gravity of the events themselves. The path forward is not easy, and it is marked by the shadows of those who are lost, but it is a path that we are duty-bound to follow. We do so with the understanding that the search for justice is the only meaningful response to the cruelty that sought to define these lives. We do so because the victims deserve nothing less than our total, unwavering dedication to the truth. We do so because the memory of the past is the light that we use to guide our journey through the present and into the future, ensuring that the dark lessons of the killing fields are never, ever forgotten, and that the promise of justice for the stolen, the forgotten, and the discarded is a promise that we continue to keep day after day, year after year, until every single story has been told and every single victim has been returned, at last, to the respect and dignity they have been denied for far, far too long. This is the work, this is the burden, and this is the enduring, final, and necessary obligation that we carry forward as we stand, together, at the edge of the field, looking back at the dark, silent expanse and refusing, ever again, to turn our eyes away from the absolute and piercing truth. The final chapter of this long and agonizing journey into the dark heart of the Texas killing fields requires us to stand in the quiet aftermath of the truth we have uncovered, looking at the landscape not as it was, but as it is now, a space permanently altered by the weight of the secrets it once harbored. Throughout these 10 parts, we have walked the path of the victims, the investigators, and the families, moving from the initial, desperate days of confusion into the structured, modern era of forensic resolution. We have seen how the marshland along the I-45 corridor, once thought to be an impenetrable sanctuary for monsters, has slowly surrendered its narrative to the persistent, uncompromising light of science and human dedication. This concluding reflection serves as a final testament to the resilience of memory, the slow, grinding machinery of justice, and the fundamental, non-negotiable importance of restoring the names and the humanity of those who were so cruelly stolen from the world. The story of the killing fields is, ultimately, not one of defeat, but one of a long, arduous, and essential reclamation. It is a story of how a community, a society, and a legal system finally, after decades of silence, found the strength to look directly at the horror, to name the perpetrators, and to honor the lives that were so violently cut short. The evolution of our understanding of these crimes has been perhaps the most significant transformation in the entire history of the region. Where there was once only suspicion, fear, and a hollow, paralyzing uncertainty, there is now a clearer, albeit still incomplete, map of the darkness. The work of identifying the victims, of giving back the names of women like Heidi Vireal-Fay and Brenda Jones, has shifted the focus from the identity of the monsters to the dignity of the people they sought to erase. This shift is not a superficial change. It is a fundamental act of justice. It asserts that the victims are not merely historical artifacts of a crime wave, but living, breathing, and deeply missed individuals whose lives have an inherent value that persists long after their deaths. By centering their stories, we have changed the nature of the conversation surrounding the killing fields. We have moved from a narrative of sensationalist true crime, which often focuses on the depravity of the perpetrator, to a narrative of historical empathy, which focuses on the restoration of the victim. This is the only responsible way to tell this story, and it is the only way that acknowledges the true, immense, and devastating scale of the loss that was suffered along the I-45 corridor. As we look toward the future of investigative work, we must also recognize that the tools at our disposal are not static. They are in a constant state of refinement. The forensic breakthroughs that have provided such crucial, late-stage breakthroughs in these cases are merely the starting point for a broader, ongoing technological revolution in the pursuit of justice. We are entering an age where the limitations of the past, the degraded samples, the incomplete data, the insurmountable geographic barriers, are being systematically dismantled by the power of high-fidelity genetic data and sophisticated analytical modeling. This means that for the many victims of the killing fields who remain unidentified, the hope for resolution is not a fading, nostalgic dream but a tangible, scientific possibility. We must continue to invest in this potential, not just by funding the labs and the researchers, but by maintaining a societal commitment to the idea that no case is ever truly closed until the truth has been fully illuminated. The passage of time, which was once the greatest ally of the predator, is rapidly becoming a neutral and, in some cases, an adversarial factor as our ability to extract information from the past continues to grow. The families who've been at the core of this saga remain the most important stakeholders in our collective memory of the killing fields. Their experience, characterized by a mix of profound grief, persistent hope, and the often frustrating reality of a legal system that moves at a glacial pace, is the heart of the narrative. We must ensure that their needs remain a priority as we move forward. This includes not just the provision of information when new evidence is found, but the provision of ongoing, compassionate support that recognizes the long-term, psychological impact of these crimes. We must foster a culture that respects the sanctity of their loss and that understands that for them, the search for truth is not just a job or a project, but a central, defining aspect of their lives. We owe them a debt of gratitude for the patience they have shown, for the advocacy they have provided, and for the strength they have demonstrated in keeping the memory of their loved ones alive when the entire world seemed ready to consign them to the mud. In the final assessment, the Texas killing fields must be viewed as a permanent, cautionary landmark in our societal landscape, a place where the absence of oversight, the breakdown of community trust, and the presence of predatory malice created a perfect storm of tragedy. It is a landmark that reminds us of the importance of maintaining a high, consistent, and rigorous level of communal vigilance. We must be aware of the ways in which our environments, both physical and social, can be manipulated by those who seek to do us harm. We must be willing to engage with the difficult questions about how our institutions are working, whether they are adequately resourced, and whether they are truly serving the interests of those who are most vulnerable. The killing fields are a stark and necessary reminder that safety is not a passive state, but an active, shared, and essential responsibility that we owe to one another. By learning the lessons of the past, we are better prepared to protect the future, ensuring that the spaces we inhabit are defined by the values of respect, empathy, and the fundamental and unwavering protection of human life. We stand today at the end of this 10-part narrative, but we also stand at the beginning of a continued, long-term commitment to the truth. The story of the killing fields is not contained within these pages. It is a story that exists in the files of the local police, in the hearts of the grieving families, and in the scientific reports of the labs that are still working on the remaining evidence. It is a story that is as complex and as haunting as the marshland itself. But as we finish this final installment, we do so with a renewed sense of purpose. We acknowledge the depth of the tragedy, but we also acknowledge the strength of the human spirit that has worked so hard to bring the truth to light. We commit ourselves to the ongoing work, to the memory of the victims, and to the enduring and vital hope that justice is not just a dream, but a reality that we can and must continue to build piece by piece, story by story, until the dark chapters of our history have been fully, completely, and finally understood. The silence of the field has been broken. The names have been called out. The truth, as jagged and as painful as it may be, has been brought out of the shadows and into the light where it belongs. We have done what we set out to do. We have explored the profound and tragic history of the Texas killing fields with the utmost respect for the victims and the necessary honesty that the truth demands. We have looked at the horror, we have analyzed the process, and we have honored the memory of those who were lost. This is our collective and final act of remembrance. We leave the marshlands of Calder Road behind us now, but we take with us the lessons we have learned, the empathy we have fostered, and the deep and abiding commitment to justice that will guide our steps as we move forward into a brighter, safer, and more just future. The journey was long, the cost was unimaginably high, and the scars remain, but we have reached the point where the story is no longer dominated by the shadow of the predator, but by the clear and resilient light of the truth itself. We have ensured that the victims will never be forgotten, that their stories will be passed down, and that the promise of justice, no matter how long it takes, remains the guiding and essential beacon of our work, our duty, and our shared commitment to the humanity of everyone who was taken from us along the dark and forgotten stretch of the Texas killing fields. The culmination of our exhaustive exploration into the Texas killing fields does not arrive with a final period or a neat, closing curtain, but rather with the realization that the work of remembrance is inherently infinite. As we have meticulously dissected the history of these 30-plus lives lost in the shadow of the I-45 corridor, we have reached the profound conclusion that the true legacy of this place is not the violence that occurred, but the persistence of the human spirit in the face of absolute, overwhelming darkness. To stand here at the end of this journey is to acknowledge that the identity of the Texas killing fields has been, and must always be, reclaimed from the perpetrators. It can no longer be defined by the grotesque, predatory desires of those who utilize the marshland as a hidden graveyard, but must instead be defined by the names, the faces, and the stories of the vibrant individuals who were so unfairly taken. The final act of this narrative is not an observation, but a commitment, a solemn pledge to ensure that the process of identification, of seeking truth, and of maintaining justice continues with the same unwavering intensity that has defined the most recent, breakthrough years of these investigations. The scientific reality of these cold cases has taught us that time is not necessarily the ultimate conqueror of truth. While the elements of the Texas marshland were, for decades, highly successful in their cruel conspiracy of erasure, the evolution of forensic science has proven to be more resilient than the environment itself. The development of sophisticated genetic genealogy has provided us with a mechanism to reach back through the decades, to touch the remnants of these lives, and to pull them out from the anonymity of the mud. This technological capability is the bridge between the agonizing silence of the past and the restorative potential of the future. It is a powerful reminder that our societal commitment to justice is not limited by the degradation of physical evidence. We have learned to look at a fragment of bone or a strand of hair not as a failed piece of evidence, but as a silent, waiting witness that, with the right application of human intelligence and advanced technology, can finally speak the truth that the perpetrators tried so desperately to kill. However, the technological success of these investigations must be balanced by a renewed focus on the human side of the restorative process. The identification of a victim is the beginning of a different kind of journey for the families, a journey of mourning that is finally, mercifully, freed from the torturous burden of the unknown. As we have seen, the official restoration of a name is a significant, profound, and deeply necessary step toward healing, but it is not an end to the grief itself. It is the beginning of a more honest, grounded way of processing the loss. For the community at large, this process is equally vital. It forces us to confront the reality that these crimes were not distant, theoretical occurrences, but were, in fact, localized, intimate, and deeply damaging events that shattered the lives of real people who walked the same streets and lived in the same neighborhoods as their neighbors. By naming the victims, we are doing more than just closing a file. We are reintegrating their memories into the fabric of the community, ensuring that they are remembered for who they were, beloved daughters, sisters, mothers, and friends, rather than for how they were treated by the monsters who stole them away. Looking ahead, the systemic implications of the Texas killing fields must remain at the forefront of our collective attention. We must ask ourselves, with a brutal, unflinching honesty, why it took so long for the authorities to recognize the scope of the violence occurring along the I-45 corridor. The lessons of this failure are essential for the future of law enforcement, emphasizing the need for robust, cross-departmental communication, the importance of long-term strategic oversight for unsolved cases, and the necessity of prioritizing the safety of the most vulnerable populations. The killing fields were able to persist because the system was fragmented and because there was a quiet and pervasive assumption that the victims were somehow less deserving of the full, intense resources of the state. This is a dangerous and corrosive mindset that we must continue to actively and aggressively dismantle. The protection of life and the pursuit of justice for those whose lives have been stolen must be an absolute, non-negotiable priority that transcends the complexities of jurisdictional boundaries or the convenience of bureaucratic ease. The landscape itself, as it continues to evolve and be reshaped by the relentless and inevitable march of urban development, serves as a testament to the passage of time. Yet we must ensure that in our collective and modern efforts to modernize the region, we do not inadvertently sanitize the history of what occurred there. The memory of the killing field should be preserved, perhaps in the form of dedicated, thoughtful, and respectful memorials that keep the focus firmly on the victims and their families. These spaces would serve as an essential reminder of the necessity of vigilance, the importance of empathy, and the enduring and vital commitment to justice that must define our shared life. They would be places where the community can come together to acknowledge the weight of the past, while looking forward to a safer and more compassionate future. This is a necessary and healing path forward, one that honors the dignity of those who were lost, while simultaneously affirming our shared commitment to preventing such tragedies from occurring in our communities ever again. As we bring this 11-part series to its conclusion, we must acknowledge that the strength of this narrative lies in the collaborative effort of those who refuse to let the silence of the marshland have the final word. It lies in the detectives who stayed on the job for 40 years, the genealogists who spent thousands of hours tracing the distant branches of family trees, the journalists who kept the stories in the public eye, and, most importantly, the families who never gave up. This collective, human effort is the true, defining feature of the Killing Fields narrative. It is the force that has finally begun to bring justice to the families and peace to the spirits of the victims. We have looked at the darkness, we have analyzed the facts, and we have, through the steady and persistent pursuit of the truth, begun to slowly and surely turn the tide of the history that once defined this place. We stand now with a deeper and more complete understanding of the tragedy and with a renewed sense of the obligation that we share as a society to protect our own and to never ever let the memory of those who were taken fade into the mud. This story, from its dark and tragic beginnings to its current state of partial and ongoing resolution, is a testament to the enduring and powerful capacity of the human spirit to seek the truth against all odds. We have fulfilled our responsibility to the victims by telling their stories, by honoring their names, and by demanding that their final and necessary justice be held in the highest regard. We leave behind the dark, haunting, and silent field, knowing that while the shadows may linger, the light of our memory and our persistent search for justice is the force that will finally guide us to the end of this long journey. The victims of the Texas killing fields were once forgotten, but they are forgotten no more. They are the faces of our conscience, they are the names of our search, and they are the essence of the truth that we have so long and so desperately sought to uncover. We rest in the knowledge that the process of restorative justice is now firmly in place and that the memory of those who were stolen is a flame that will never be extinguished, not by the passing of years, not by the eroding power of the swamp, and certainly not by the cowardly silence of the monsters who once believed they could hide in the dark forever. We remain committed to the truth, we remain vigilant in the search, and we remain united in the unshakable belief that justice for the victims is the only final and only necessary way to honor the dignity of the lives that were lost along the dark and tragic stretch of Interstate 45. The journey ends here, but the memory continues, as vibrant, as clear, and as persistent as the truth itself, shining brightly in the light of a new day where the field and its dark secrets can no longer define the potential of our future.